to quiet Chronicles. Before the day fully lets go, leave behind just enough of its noise to make room for a different kind of story, the story of a man whose name became almost too famous to understand. Leonardo da Vinci is remembered as the painter of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, but the real Leonardo was stranger, more restless, and far less settled than the legend suggests. He studied smiles and skulls, rivers and wings, muscles and machines. He painted beauty with extraordinary tenderness, yet offered princes designs for fortresses, weapons, and engines of war. He was admired in his lifetime, but he also left promises unfinished, commissions abandoned, and notebooks full of ideas the world would not properly read for centuries. If you enjoy long-form history told with patience and care, a like and subscription helps Quiet Chronicles keep publishing new stories each week. And while you are here, let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. If there is a person, era, empire, mystery, or forgotten story you would like us to cover next, leave that there as well. Your suggestions often lead to future journeys. For now, the trail begins not in a palace, not in a cathedral, and not before a famous painting, but in a small Tuscan place called Vinci, where a child born outside marriage began noticing the world before the world knew his name. Chapter 1. A Child of Vinci. Vinci lay among the Tuscan hills west of Florence, close enough to feel the pull of a great city and far enough away to remain shaped by slopes, farms, stone houses, and the slow, practical rhythms of the countryside. In the middle of the 15th century, it was not a place that seemed likely to produce a name that would travel through centuries. Its families knew the weight of land, weather, inheritance, and reputation. Roads connected it to Florence, but the distance still mattered, because a child born there entered first into a world of fields and households before entering the world of guilds, courts, and commissions. Leonardo da Vinci began there on April 15, 1452. His birth was recorded by his grandfather, Antonio da Vinci, in the plain language of family memory. A son had been born to Ser Piero, Antonio's son, at the 3rd hour of the night. The child was given the name Leonardo. That small record matters because so much about Leonardo's early life has been covered later by legend, admiration, and the desire to make childhood explain greatness too neatly. The document does not describe a prodigy. It gives a date, a family, and a beginning. Ser Piero da Vinci, Leonardo's father, was a notary, and in 15th century Tuscany that profession carried weight. A notary did not merely write things down. He prepared contracts, wills, property transfers, dowries, legal declarations, and the written instruments by which families defended their claims in a world where land, marriage, and status had to be secured on paper. The notary's work belonged to a literate and respectable class, beneath the highest ranks of power but close to the machinery that made society legible. Ser Piero would spend much of his career connected to Florence, where documents, money, and influence passed through careful hands. Leonardo was born near that world, but not fully inside its expected path. Caterina, Leonardo's mother, has remained more difficult to place with certainty. Older accounts treated her simply as a local peasant woman, while later scholarship has proposed more specific possibilities, including the debated argument that she may have been an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman brought into Tuscany from farther east. The evidence does not allow every question to settle. What can be said with greater confidence is that she was not Ser Piero's wife, and Leonardo was born outside marriage. In a society attentive to legitimacy, inheritance, and household order, that fact shaped what was available to him before he was old enough to understand it. Illegitimacy in Renaissance Tuscany did not mean social disappearance. Many children born outside marriage were acknowledged, raised within extended family arrangements, apprenticed, married, or given useful places in life. Yet it did change the line of expectation. A legitimate son of Ser Piero might have been pressed more directly toward the notarial profession, with Latin study, legal formulas, and the disciplined copying of contracts as part of his future. Leonardo's position was less secure, but it also left him less bound to one inherited office. This is one of the quieter facts of his life, and it should not be made too dramatic. A restriction could also open a side door. Ser Piero married another woman shortly after Leonardo's birth, and Caterina also appears to have married elsewhere. The infant did not grow inside a simple family arrangement that modern imagination might prefer. He belonged to a network of households, acknowledgements, obligations, and partial attachments. His grandfather Antonio's record suggests that the paternal family knew and accepted him, and Leonardo spent part of his childhood within that family circle. Such arrangements were common enough not to require scandal, but they left traces in the texture of a life. Leonardo would become famous for looking closely at visible things, yet his own first social position was marked by something less visible, a place recognized but not quite regular. Vinci itself offered a different education from the one Leonardo might later receive in Florence. Hills, streams, mills, terraces, animals, trees, stones, and weather were not subjects in the formal sense, but they were available to a child's eye. Water moved through channels and gullies. Birds crossed the sky with motions that could be watched long before they could be explained. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers handled tools according to inherited practice, and those tools gave form to daily intelligence. Nothing in the surviving record lets anyone describe the young Leonardo pausing over a specific bird or stream at a specific hour. The safer and more useful point is that his earliest surroundings gave him abundant things to observe before books gave him systems. Florence, not far away, was already one of the most important cities in Europe, but its greatness did not float above the countryside. It drew in grain, oil, wool, timber, labor, legal business, and ambitious young men. Families like the Da Vinci family lived partly by connection to the city's needs. Ser Piero's profession belonged to the written side of this larger world, where a spoken agreement could become a binding document and a family's memory could become enforceable fact. Leonardo grew near the border between practical rural knowledge and urban professional culture. Later, that border would matter more than any simple story of genius rising untouched from nature. The boy's formal education seems to have been limited when compared with that of a classically trained humanist. He did not receive the deep Latin schooling that shaped many learned men of his age. Throughout his life, he would sometimes refer to himself as a man without letters, meaning not that he was ignorant, but that he lacked the prestigious education of university-trained scholars and Latin authors. This absence mattered. It left him outside certain intellectual circles, but it also helped turn his authority towards sight, experiment, drawing, measurement, and repeated testing. When learnt men quoted ancient texts, Leonardo often wanted to see how the thing itself behaved. That habit did not emerge all at once. Children do not become investigators by declaration. They gather tendencies through repetition, approval, frustration, and the small satisfactions of noticing what others pass over. Leonardo's later notebooks show an almost tireless appetite for the mechanics of ordinary things. How water curls around an obstacle, how hair falls in waves, how muscles pull the mouth into expression, how light changes the edge of a form. The seeds of that appetite cannot be documented scene by scene in Vinci. Still, the distance between his later questions and his early surroundings is not great. A child raised among moving water, animals, handmade tools, and uneven land had no shortage of forms to study. Ser Piero's world also mattered because it connected Leonardo to opportunity. A child with no acknowledged father in a rural household might have had a much narrower life. Leonardo, however, carried the Da Vinci name and stood close enough to his father's ambitions to be moved when talent became visible. Ser Piero's profession brought him into contact with clients, property holders, religious institutions, and the city's working elite. The exact moment when he recognized Leonardo's artistic promise is not preserved. Later tradition says that drawings by the boy impressed him enough to show them to Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, but the story comes through biographical memory rather than hard record. What remains credible is the larger movement. Leonardo's ability was noticed, and his father had the connections to place it somewhere useful. The Florence awaiting him was not merely a city of painters. It was a city of workshops, contracts, guilds, merchants, devotional images, public commissions, private chapels, civic pride, and family display. Art belonged to that social machinery. A painting might serve prayer, memory, prestige, politics, or domestic honor. A sculpted figure could mark a church, a palace, a tomb, or a public square. The young Leonardo was not being sent into a world where inspiration alone mattered. He was being sent into a world where skill had to become service, and service had to satisfy patrons who paid in money, influence, or protection. Before that move, Vinci remained the first name attached to him. Leonardo did not become known by a family surname in the modern sense. Da Vinci meant from Vinci, and the place stayed joined to him because origin was part of identity. To later centuries, the phrase would become almost inseparable from the man, polished by museums, books, reproductions, and admiration. In his own world, it was simpler and more local. It marked where he came from. The distance from Vinci to Florence was not enormous, but for Leonardo it carried a change of scale. The hills and households of childhood gave way to streets where craft was organized, talent was tested, and a young person could learn by serving under a master. In that city, the eye that had watched the world informally would be trained by rules, materials, deadlines, and correction. Pigments had to be prepared. Panels had to be made ready. Drawings had to answer to the judgment of men who knew the difference between charm and discipline. Leonardo entered history first as a child recorded in a family note, then as a youth whose gifts carried him toward Florence. Nothing about that beginning required the later legend to unfold. He might have become a skilled craftsman of local importance, a workshop assistant remembered only in payments, or a talented painter whose name survived in a few documents and uncertain attributions. The path widened because his eye, his hand, his father's connections, and Florence's appetite for skill met at the right moment. From the quiet hill country around Vinci, Leonardo was carried toward the workshop door where beauty would become labor before it became fame. Chapter 2: Florence and the Workshop Door. Florence did not receive Leonardo as a legend. It received him as a young provincial with an unusual hand, a father able to make useful introductions, and a future still dependent on discipline. The city was already famous, but its fame rested on work before it rested on memory. Wool merchants, bankers, goldsmiths, stonecutters, builders, notaries, dyers, carvers, and painters made Florence dense with skill. Even its beauty had a practical foundation, because altarpieces, chapels, palace fronts, devotional panels, marriage chests, banners, bronze ornaments, and tombs all came through hands trained to serve a patron's purpose. The Florence of Leonardo's youth was governed not only by public offices, but by families, guilds, friendships, debts, favors, and reputation. The Medici had not yet become dukes. They ruled more indirectly, through money, alliance, placement, and the careful management of civic life. Lorenzo de' Medici would later become the most famous figure in that world, but the city's power did not belong to him alone. Florence was a republic in form, a merchant city in habit, and a theater of status in daily practice. To enter it as a young artist was to enter a system where talent needed patrons, and patrons needed visible signs of devotion, lineage, taste, and power. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero, seems to have helped place him where such talent could be tested. The place was the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected masters in Florence. Verrocchio was not only a painter. He worked as a sculptor, goldsmith, designer, and maker of objects that crossed the boundary between art and skilled manufacture. His bottega belonged to a world in which the later separation between fine art and craft would have seemed much less firm. A young apprentice entering that shop did not step into a room where paintings alone were made. He entered a working institution. The workshop door mattered because it marked the beginning of Leonardo's formal education. Whatever he had noticed in Vinci now had to pass through method. Pigments had to be ground to the right fineness. Panels had to be prepared with layers of gesso, smoothed and made ready for drawing and paint. Brushes, glues, varnishes, cartoons, metal tools, clay models, and unfinished commissions surrounded the apprentice with the material grammar of making. Before a hand could be praised as graceful, it had to become obedient. Verrocchio's workshop trained the eye by training the body. Apprentices learned by repetition, correction, copying, and service. A boy might begin with errands, cleaning, preparing materials, and observing older assistants. He would learn how a drawing could be transferred, how a fold of cloth could be arranged, how a face could be built through light and shadow, how gold leaf behaved, how tempera dried, and how a commission moved from agreement to finished object. The work was not romantic, it was exacting, and its exactness gave Leonardo something his childhood could not give him, a discipline shared by other trained hands. Florentine workshops were also social places. A master's name might stand on a completed work even when many hands had contributed to it. Assistants prepared backgrounds, painted secondary figures, repeated patterns, and learnt the master's manner until their own manner could be trusted. The modern hunger to isolate the single genius inside every brushstroke would have been strange to the ordinary business of a 15th century bottega. Reputation gathered around the master, but production depended on a household of labor. Leonardo's early development must be understood inside that collective structure. Andrea del Verrocchio himself gave Leonardo a demanding model. He had a sculptor's sense of volume, a goldsmith's patience with surface, and a designer's readiness to solve practical problems. His works needed firmness and finish. A bronze figure required understanding of casting, weight, and balance. A painted panel required control of line, color, preparation, and devotional clarity. A workshop master could not survive on inspiration alone, because patrons expected delivery, materials cost money, and unfinished promises injured reputation. Under Verrocchio, Leonardo entered a place where beauty had accounts attached to it. Florence guild culture reinforced this discipline. Painters were connected to the guild system, and professional identity had to pass through recognized institutions. A young artist's progress was not merely a private matter between talent and ambition. It depended on registration, training, workshop association, and the trust of people who commissioned work. Guilds protected standards, but they also protected hierarchies. They reminded every gifted young man that skill became livelihood only when society made room for it. Leonardo's position in this world was unusual in several ways. He had not been shaped by the full classical education of elite humanists, but he had entered a workshop where knowledge lived in objects and procedures. Geometry appeared in perspective. Anatomy appeared in the study of bodies and movement. Chemistry appeared in pigments, binders, metals, and surface preparation. Mechanics appeared in pulleys, hoists, molds, tools, and devices used for festivals or construction. Without enrolling in a university, Leonardo entered a place where many forms of practical knowledge touched one another every day. Florence itself encouraged that crossing of skills. The city needed artists who could serve churches, confraternities, families, guilds, and civic institutions. A painter might design decoration for a festival. A sculptor might understand architecture. A goldsmith might become a master of drawing. A workshop could produce religious images, domestic objects, public works, and temporary displays. The hand that learned to paint an angel might also learn to design a helmet, a banner, a costume, or an ornament for a ceremony. Leonardo's later range seems less impossible when seen against this early environment. The Medici world deepened the same lesson. Power in Florence liked to present itself through beauty, learning, piety, and generosity. A family chapel, a commissioned altarpiece, a sculpted tomb, or a public gift could carry social meaning without announcing political control too loudly. Artists served this language. They made devotion visible, wealth respectable, memory durable, and influence graceful. For a young apprentice, the lesson was plain enough. Art did not live outside power. It worked near it, depended on it, and sometimes softened its appearance. Leonardo's earliest years in Verrocchio's shop therefore placed him at the meeting point of several forces. There was the hard daily labor of craft. There was the social order of the guild. There was the patron's need for beauty with purpose. There was the Florentine respect for drawing as a foundation of artistic thought. And there was the young man himself, attentive, technically hungry, and perhaps already less willing than others to accept inherited solutions without testing them against what the eye could discover. Drawing became central. In Florence, drawing was not merely preparation for painting. It was the means by which thought passed into visible form. A line could test a hand, a sleeve, a curl of hair, a horse's leg, the tilt of a head, or the fall of light along a cheek. Through drawing, the apprentice learned proportion, correction, invention, and restraint. Leonardo would later fill sheets with studies that seem to think while they move, but the foundation of that habit belonged to the workshop, where paper and point trained attention before fame attached meaning to it. One can imagine Verrocchio's bottega not as a quiet sanctuary, but as a place of layered work. Apprentices moved between tasks. Materials dried or waited. A master judged, corrected, assigned, and supervised. Clients might appear with expectations. Religious subjects were repeated because devotion required familiar forms, yet each commission demanded enough distinction to satisfy the person paying for it. In such a place, Leonardo learned that making an image was never only a matter of seeing. It was also a matter of sequence, material, agreement, hierarchy, and patience. That education suited him, but it may also have begun to reveal his difference. Some apprentices became reliable followers of a master's style. Others became competent professionals whose names survive only in records. Leonardo learned the workshop's disciplines, yet his later career suggests that he was already drawn toward problems that exceeded ordinary completion. A figure was not just a figure. It was bone under skin, motion held in stillness, light crossing form, expression beginning before speech. A landscape was not merely background. It was water, geology, atmosphere, distance, and time gathered behind the human subject. The workshop gave Leonardo his first serious language for those questions. It taught him how to prepare, observe, draw, revise, and serve. It also placed him inside a city where art had to answer to institutions larger than the artist. Florence did not offer him freedom in the modern sense. It offered pressure, structure, materials, rivalry, and the chance to measure himself against skilled men. For Leonardo, that was enough to begin transforming raw attention into trained sight. By the time his apprenticeship matured, the child from Vinci had become something more difficult to define. He was not yet the painter of the works that would make him famous. He was not yet the court engineer who would offer machines to princes. He was not yet the anatomist, mapmaker, designer of festivals, student of water, or keeper of notebooks that later centuries would search with astonishment. He was a young man shaped by a workshop door that had opened from rural observation into urban discipline. Inside Verrocchio's Florence, Leonardo learned to see with his hand, and that hand was beginning to move beyond the lessons it had been given. Chapter 3: The Apprentice Who Learned to See. Leonardo's early years in Florence were not a simple ascent from obscurity into brilliance. They were years of looking, copying, correcting, and absorbing the habits of a city that treated skill as something made slowly. In Verrocchio's workshop, a young apprentice could not separate the beautiful object from the work that produced it. A painted face began with drawing. A painted garment began with the study of cloth. A sacred figure began with a body that had to stand, lean, turn, gesture, and occupy space with enough conviction to seem alive. The discipline of sight became one of Leonardo's first real inheritances. He did not receive it from a university or from the Latin books that shaped learned men. He received it from surfaces, tools, models, and repetition. Silver point drawing, one of the demanding techniques used in the period, did not forgive a careless hand easily. The mark could not be erased in the way charcoal might be softened or paint corrected. A young artist using it had to learn pressure, control, confidence, and restraint. Such training suited a mind that would later return again and again to the problem of how a visible thing becomes knowable. Verrocchio's Florence also gave Leonardo companions in ambition, even when the record does not allow every relationship to be described closely. Sandro Botticelli, Pietro Perugino, and Domenico Ghirlandaio belonged to the same broad artistic world, moving through workshops, commissions, guild expectations, and patronage networks that made Florence unusually rich in trained eyes. These were not isolated geniuses waiting in separate rooms. They were young men inside a competitive culture where one master's solution could be studied by another, where a figure type could pass from workshop to workshop, and where a painter's progress depended on seeing what others had done and finding a way to do something more exact, more persuasive, or more graceful. For Leonardo, the human figure became a field of special attention. Hands mattered because hands carried thought before speech did. A face mattered because expression could begin in small transitions rather than fixed signs. Cloth mattered because drapery revealed the body beneath it while also obeying its own weight. Hair mattered because it moved in waves, curls, and fine strands that seemed to share a family resemblance with water. The young apprentice did not yet have the anatomical knowledge that would mark his later notebooks, but the direction of his curiosity was already visible in the things he chose to study. Workshop training turned that curiosity into procedure. Drapery could be arranged over clay or wax models and studied as light crossed its ridges and hollows. A head could be drawn from one angle, then another, until the artist understood not only its outline, but its rotation. Animals could be watched for movement, proportion, and tension. Plants could be copied not as generic decoration, but as forms with particular leaves, stems, and patterns of growth. In this way, Leonardo's eye was trained to resist the lazy symbol. A tree could not remain just a tree. A hand could not remain just a hand. The collaborative nature of Verrocchio's workshop makes Leonardo's early development difficult to isolate, but also easier to understand. In a bottega, the master's work and the apprentice's labor often lived on the same surface. One assistant might prepare a ground, another might paint a passage of landscape, another might work under the master's correction on a secondary figure. The final object carried the authority of the workshop, not the private signature of each contributor. Later centuries, hungry for the first unmistakable sign of Leonardo, have looked closely at such works to find where his hand may have entered. The most famous example is Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ. The painting shows Christ in the Jordan, John the Baptist beside him, and angels attending near the edge of the sacred action. Tradition, especially through Giorgio Vasari's later account, held that Leonardo painted one of the angels with such beauty that Verrocchio gave up painting in recognition of his pupil's superiority. That story has the shape of legend, and it should be handled with care. Masters do not usually surrender an entire art because a gifted apprentice paints one passage well. Yet the tradition persists because viewers have long sensed a difference in the softness, movement, and delicacy associated with Leonardo's contribution. The angel matters less as a miracle of rivalry than as a sign of transition. In the passage attributed to Leonardo, the figure seems to turn with a living ease, and the handling suggests an interest in atmosphere and gentle transition rather than hard boundary alone. The young artist was learning from Verrocchio, but he was also beginning to move beyond certain workshop habits. A figure could be outlined, modeled, and colored according to the discipline of the shop. It could also be made to breathe more softly inside the space around it. Vasari's story, even if polished by later memory, tells something true about how artistic fame was remembered in Renaissance biography. The pupil's gift had to be shown in a moment. The master had to recognize it. The world had to receive a sign that greatness had arrived. Actual development was slower and less theatrical. Leonardo's difference formed across many acts of looking, many corrections, and many unfinished attempts that no one preserved. The angel became a useful emblem because history often prefers a visible beginning to a long apprenticeship. By 1472, Leonardo was registered with the Company of St. Luke, the Painters' Guild in Florence. This did not mean that he immediately left Verrocchio or became a fully independent master in the modern sense. Workshop ties could continue after formal registration. A young artist might remain connected to the master who had trained him, working within familiar networks while gradually taking on more responsibility. Still, the registration placed Leonardo inside a recognized professional body. His skill was no longer merely a family hope or a workshop promise. It had a civic and institutional form. Florentine artists of Leonardo's generation inherited a city already transformed by earlier achievements. Masaccio had given painting a new gravity of form. Donatello had changed sculpture with psychological and bodily force. Brunelleschi had altered architecture and perspective. Alberti had written about painting in ways that gave theory to practice. These names did not sit behind Leonardo as distant monuments only. Their solutions were present in churches, buildings, conversations, drawings, and expectations. A young painter in Florence worked under the pressure of visible excellence. Leonardo absorbed that pressure differently from some of his contemporaries. Botticelli's line could become lyrical and searching. Ghirlandaio could organize the civic and devotional world with clarity and rich social detail. Perugino developed a calm, spacious sweetness that would influence a younger generation. Leonardo's path bent toward transition itself, the passage from light to shadow, stillness to motion, thought to expression, surface to hidden structure. Such interests made him powerful. But they could also make completion difficult, because every visible answer opened another question beneath it. The study of nature became, for Leonardo, more than a decorative resource. In many workshops, plants, rocks, rivers, animals, and distant landscapes could serve as supporting elements around sacred or human subjects. Leonardo's later work suggests that he could not leave them as mere background. A plant had growth. Water had motion. Rock had formation. Light had behavior. Even before his notebooks made these interests explicit, his artistic development was moving toward a world in which every visible thing had causes, and every cause invited study. This made his apprenticeship both ordinary and unusual. It was ordinary because he learned through the established structures of a Florentine workshop. It was unusual because the range of his attention would not remain confined to the tasks that made a painter employable. Patrons needed altarpieces, portraits, designs, and finished commissions. Leonardo needed those things as well because he had to live. Yet his mind appears to have found equal urgency in the curl of hair, the engineering of a wing, the flow of water, the tension of a tendon, and the geometry of sight. The future difficulty of his career was already present in that abundance. There was also a social education in these years. Leonardo learned how artists depended on reputation, and how reputation depended on delivery as well as brilliance. He saw that masters negotiated, patrons requested changes, assistants performed invisible labor, and payments followed agreements that could become strained. Beauty emerged from this system, but not outside it. The young man from Vinci was being trained not only to see the world, but to survive among those who paid for what he saw. The more he learned, the more Florence gave him to measure himself against. Its churches held images meant for prayer and memory. Its palaces held signs of family ambition. Its workshops held young competitors, practiced masters, and the constant evidence that skill could be refined further. Leonardo's gift was not that he escaped this world. His gift was that he entered it deeply enough to learn its methods, then began asking questions its methods could not fully answer. That is why the apprentice years cannot be treated merely as a preface to the famous life. They formed the grammar of everything that followed. The careful drawing, the attention to material, the respect for visible evidence, the mingling of art and craft, the dependence on patrons, and the habit of leaving one problem only after it had opened several more all belonged to this Florentine education. Leonardo had come from Vinci with a searching eye. In Verrocchio's workshop, that eye learnt discipline, and discipline gave his curiosity a hand strong enough to follow it. Chapter 4. Angels, Accusations, and Early Ambition. Leonardo's first years as a recognized Florentine artist unfolded inside a city that rewarded talent but watched reputation closely. Florence could be generous to skill, especially when skill served devotion, family honor, civic display, or the prestige of a powerful patron. It could also be severe in quieter ways. A young man might move among workshops, churches, commissions, and friendships with increasing confidence, yet still remain dependent on what others said of him, what officials recorded, and whether patrons believed he could be trusted with work that mattered. Leonardo entered early adulthood inside that mixture of opportunity and exposure. His name had begun to take institutional shape by the early 1470s. Registration with the Painters Guild placed him within Florence's professional order, even if he likely continued to work in or near Verrocchio's circle. The guild did not make him famous by itself. It gave him standing. It meant that the child from Vinci had become a working artist in a city where artistic labor belonged to rules, payments, obligations, and recognized membership. A young painter still had to prove himself one commission at a time. The works associated with Leonardo's early independence show an artist already difficult to contain. Some paintings from these years are debated in attribution, and the historian has to move carefully around them. The temptation is to turn every uncertain panel into a declaration of genius, but the record is not always that obedient. What can be said is that Leonardo's early style began to show a taste for softened transitions, living gesture, delicate observation, and figures that seemed to turn inward as much as outward. He was learning how to give a painted body not only shape, but mood. The angel associated with Verrocchio's baptism of Christ remained the most famous sign of that early difference. Later biography made it a story of sudden triumph, with the pupil surpassing the master in one visible passage. The truth was probably quieter. Verrocchio's workshop was collaborative, and a young painter's contribution would have emerged under discipline, correction, and shared practice. Still, the tradition endured because the contrast was meaningful. Leonardo's hand, wherever it can be identified with confidence, had begun to soften the boundaries between figure and air, between expression and restraint, between form and the life that seemed to move within it. In Florence, however, artistic promise did not protect a young man from the city's moral and legal machinery. In 1476, Leonardo's name appeared in a record connected to an accusation of sodomy, along with several others. The accusation was made through the city's system of denunciation, and the case was dismissed after no witnesses came forward. The surviving document is brief. It does not let the private life behind the accusation be recovered, and it should not be treated as permission to invent one. Its importance lies in the fact that it exists at all, a sudden hard mark in a life whose early years are otherwise so difficult to see. Florence had a complex relationship with public morality. It was a city of churches, sermons, processions, and devotional art, but also of rumor, youthful circles, political tension, and social behavior that authorities tried repeatedly to regulate. Accusations could carry danger even when they failed in court. A name placed in a legal record could leave a shadow, especially for someone still building a career. Leonardo was young, dependent on patrons and professional trust, and not yet protected by the international fame that later centuries would give him. The dismissal ended the formal matter, but the document remains one of those places where the archive opens briefly and then closes again. That silence must be respected. Leonardo's private affections, desires, and emotional life have been discussed for centuries, often with more confidence than the evidence allows. He never married. No children of his are known. His households later included young male pupils and companions, including Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known as Salai, and Francesco Melzi. These facts matter, but they do not turn the 1476 record into a complete biography of the inner life. A warm chronicle can admit uncertainty without pretending that uncertainty is emptiness. In Leonardo's case, the record gives fragments, and the fragments have to remain fragments. Professionally, the years after the accusation show him still moving forward, but not always smoothly. Leonardo received commissions, yet he also began to show the pattern that would follow him throughout his life: extraordinary promise joined to delay, alteration, and unfinished work. This was not merely a flaw of temperament, although patrons could certainly experience it that way. His manner of working seems to have made completion difficult, because each task opened into a wider field of problems. A face required understanding expression. A body required understanding structure. A landscape required understanding water, rock, light, and distance. A painting could become an investigation. One early commission that reveals this mixture was the Adoration of the Magi, ordered in 1481 by the monks of San Donato a Scopato near Florence. The work remained unfinished, but even in its incomplete state it shows Leonardo's ambition widening beyond conventional arrangement. The subject was familiar, the Magi arriving before the Christ child. Many painters could organize such a scene with dignity and clarity. Leonardo instead filled the composition with circling movement, searching faces, horses, ruins, and figures drawn into a restless field around the central group. The unfinished surface lets the viewer see thought still at work. The Adoration is valuable because it shows Leonardo before polish. Lines, underdrawing, tonal passages, and unresolved forms remain visible. The painting does not present a completed devotional image so much as a mind arranging intensity across a large panel. Figures lean, gather, turn, and look. The ruins behind them suggest history and collapse without requiring a separate explanation. Horses appear not as decoration, but as living force at the edge of sacred recognition. A patron waiting for a finished altarpiece might have seen delay. Later viewers see the traces of invention before it settled. Such unfinished works have shaped Leonardo's reputation in two opposing ways. They have frustrated those who want the career of a reliable master moving from commission to completed commission. They have fascinated those who see in his incompletion the evidence of a mind unwilling to stop at the expected answer. Both responses contain some truth. Leonardo did disappoint patrons. He also used painting as a form of inquiry more demanding than many patrons required. The difficulty is that a commission is an agreement, while inquiry follows its own appetite. Florence gave him chances, but Milan began to appear more suitable to the full range of what he wanted to offer. In Florence, he was one gifted artist among many, still measured within the competitive world of painters, sculptors, guilds, and civic commissions. In Milan, a ducal court might need something broader: military engineering, festival design, architecture, hydraulic schemes, music, pageantry, portraiture, and dynastic display. Leonardo's talents did not fit neatly into the category of painter alone. He may have sensed that a prince could use what a Florentine patron might not know how to ask for. Lorenzo de' Medici's Florence remained important in this transition. Lorenzo's circle valued art, music, philosophy, poetry, antique learning, and the graceful display of power. Yet Leonardo was not simply absorbed into the deepest intellectual center of Medici humanism. His education remained practical, visual, and experimental rather than classically literary. He could move near cultivated circles without fully belonging to the Latin scholarly world that gave many Renaissance men their prestige. This distance did not weaken him. It helped make his work answerable to observation in a way that often feels different from the work of men trained primarily by texts. The decision to leave Florence for Milan was therefore not an abandonment of art, but an expansion of the field in which art could operate. Leonardo did not present himself to Ludovico Sforza primarily as the painter of tender faces and sacred gestures. In the famous letter associated with his Milanese ambitions, he emphasized military and engineering abilities before turning finally to painting and sculpture. Whether every claim in that letter reflected proven experience is less important than the order of the claims. Leonardo understood that power listened for usefulness. That self-presentation reveals a young man still seeking the right kind of patronage. He was not yet the serene master of museum memory. He was ambitious, strategic, and aware that beauty alone might not secure his future. The same hand that could paint an angel with unusual softness could also advertise bridges, siege devices, armored vehicles, and methods for attacking or defending fortified places. The contradiction feels modern only if art and war are imagined as separate worlds. In Renaissance Italy, they often stood very close together because courts required both magnificence and defense. By the early 1480s, Leonardo's Florentine beginning had reached a turning point. He had been trained in one of the city's finest workshops. He had entered the professional order of painters. He had been touched by legal danger and left partly hidden by the silence that followed. He had begun works of striking ambition and had already shown the difficulty of finishing what his imagination enlarged. Florence had taught him to see, to draw, to prepare, to serve, and to compete. It had not yet given him a stable place equal to the variety of his mind. Milan offered a different stage. Its ruler needed artists, engineers, designers, musicians, and makers of spectacle who could help turn power into visible form. Leonardo carried with him the training of Verrocchio's workshop, the uncertainty of early commissions, and the confidence of a man who believed he could solve problems beyond painting. The road north did not lead away from beauty. It led toward a court where beauty would be asked to stand beside machinery, fortification, ceremony, ambition, and war. Chapter 5. Milan receives a Florentine. Milan stood apart from Florence in almost every political habit that mattered to Leonardo. Florence had trained him inside a republic of guilds, workshops, merchant families, and careful civic display. Milan belonged to a ducal world where power gathered more openly around a ruling house and where the court needed splendor, ceremony, military readiness, and visible signs of command. A Florentine artist arriving there did not enter the same kind of city in a larger size. He entered a different arrangement of power. Leonardo came north in the early 1480s, when his Florentine career had shown promise without yet giving him the stable greatness later centuries would assume. He had been trained by Verrocchio, registered as a painter, associated with ambitious works, and marked by the pattern of delay that would follow him for the rest of his life. Florence had many artists. It could admire skill while still leaving a gifted man crowded among rivals, patrons, and expectations. Milan offered another possibility, a court that might value the many things Leonardo believed he could do. Ludovico Sforza, known as Ludovico il Moro, was the man whose service Leonardo sought. He was not yet duke in the most secure and formal sense when Leonardo first entered his orbit, but he was the dominant power in Milan, ruling in practice, while dynastic arrangements gave the state its outward form. His position required constant maintenance. A ruler in Renaissance Italy could not depend on blood alone, because rival claims, foreign powers, mercenary captains, papal politics, and local factions pressed against every court. Legitimacy had to be performed as well as inherited. Leonardo understood enough about patronage to present himself accordingly. The famous letter associated with his approach to Ludovico is one of the clearest documents of his ambition. Its order is striking. Leonardo did not begin by asking to be valued as the painter of sacred tenderness, graceful figures, or subtle faces. He began with war. He described portable bridges, methods for draining moats, designs for siege works, covered vehicles, artillery, and devices useful in attack or defense. Only after this long list of military and engineering abilities did he mention that in times of peace, he could also satisfy the Duke in architecture, sculpture, and painting. The letter has often been read with surprise because modern memory usually approaches Leonardo through museums rather than through arsenals. Yet the letter made sense in the world that produced it. Italian courts needed engineers as much as painters. Fortified cities had to be inspected. Canals had to be managed. Festivals had to be staged. Dynastic monuments had to be designed. Temporary machines, theatrical devices, weapons, pageants, and buildings all belonged to the same broad culture of service. Leonardo was not abandoning art by offering military skill. He was enlarging the definition of usefulness. Whether every promise in the letter represented an already tested ability is impossible to know fully. Some claims sound like practical competence. Others may have been aspirational, a young and ambitious man describing what he believed he could devise if given the opportunity. Patronage often began with such acts of self-fashioning. A court wanted confidence, and an applicant wanted room. Leonardo's letter should not be mistaken for a resume in the modern sense. It was a performance of capability addressed to power. Milan itself gave that performance a ready audience. The city had a strong military and administrative character, shaped by the needs of a large territorial state. It also had a courtly appetite for magnificence. The Sforza rulers wanted to appear not as temporary soldiers who had risen by force, but as dynastic princes with memory, culture, and grandeur behind them. Art could help with that work. So could architecture, ceremonies, music, portraits, sculpture, engineering, and public display. Leonardo arrived in a place where many of his interests could be understood as parts of one service. The Florentine workshop had taught him to make beauty under discipline. Milan asked whether beauty could serve rule. This question did not need to be spoken directly. It was present in the court's commissions, festivals, portraits, monuments, machines, and ceremonies. A ruler's power had to be made visible in halls, churches, processions, entertainments, fortifications, and dynastic images. The painter who could also design, advise, invent, and entertain became more valuable than a painter alone. Leonardo's unusual range, which may have made him difficult to place in Florence, could become an advantage in Milan. Music may have helped him enter this world. Later accounts suggest that Leonardo came to Milan with a talent for performance, perhaps bringing or designing a silver lyre shaped in an unusual way. The details are colored by biography, but the general point fits the courtly setting. A Renaissance court valued grace of presentation. To be useful there was not only to deliver panels or drawings, it was to appear capable, inventive, pleasing, and adaptable in the presence of men whose favor could transform a life. Leonardo had the manners, beauty, intelligence, and technical imagination to make an impression. His early Milanese service did not immediately produce the famous works that would later define the period. Court life often moved through many smaller demands. Designs were requested. Entertainments required invention. Engineering problems invited advice. Portraits, decorations, architectural thoughts, and sculptural plans could circulate before any one project became central. A court artist's life was not always a clean sequence of masterpieces. It was a web of service, waiting, proposal, partial execution, and dependence on the shifting attention of a patron. Ludovico's Milan also offered Leonardo access to a different intellectual and technical environment. The city's canals, fortifications, military needs, and Lombard artistic traditions gave him problems unlike those of Florence. Water mattered in Milan in a practical way, not only as a subject for observation. Defensive works and urban planning had direct political value. Court ceremonies demanded machines and visual invention. In this setting, Leonardo's notebooks could begin to gather the kinds of questions that crossed boundaries between art, mechanics, and natural philosophy. The move changed his identity. In Florence, he had been one artist among several remarkable artists. In Milan, he increasingly became a man of many services: painter, engineer, designer of entertainments, sculptor in promise, student of machines, and advisor on technical matters. That variety should not be smoothed into an easy legend. It was also a source of strain. A man who offers many abilities must satisfy many expectations. A court that admires invention still wants delivery. Leonardo's mind widened in Milan, but the old difficulty of completion did not disappear. Among Ludovico's ambitions, one project would eventually draw Leonardo into extraordinary scale: the equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father. Before that monument came fully into view, however, Leonardo had to settle into the patterns of Milanese service. He had to learn the court's needs, its ceremonies, its rivalries, its language of prestige, and the ways in which a ruler's favor could lift a project or leave it suspended. Patronage was never just generosity. It was a relationship of power, and the artist lived inside its conditions. The Sforza court also placed Leonardo near the politics of appearance. Ludovico needed to look like a ruler whose authority was natural, cultivated, and enduring. This mattered because his rule had complexities beneath the surface. The young Duke Gian Galeazzo Sforza had the formal dynastic position for a time, while Ludovico held practical control. Such arrangements could be managed, but they made display even more important. Ceremony, marriage alliances, religious patronage, architectural plans, and works of art all helped create the impression of order. Leonardo's work would serve that impression, even when his own interests wandered far beyond it. Milan received him then, not as the Leonardo known to the world now, but as a talented Florentine seeking a broader stage. He brought with him the training of Verrocchio's workshop, the ambition of unfinished Florentine projects, the confidence to offer military inventions, and the eye of a painter who could make surfaces breathe. The court gave him opportunity, but opportunity in a court always came with dependence. A patron could open rooms, assign work, delay payment, change priorities, and bind an artist's future to political fortune. For a time, that bargain suited Leonardo. Milan gave him space to imagine more than altarpieces and portraits. It allowed him to think about fortresses, canals, machines, pageants, monuments, and the public theatre of rule. It placed him near men who had the resources to ask for large things, even if those large things might later remain unfinished. The Florentine apprentice had become a court servant of unusual range, and the next shape of his life would be drawn not only with brushes, but with instruments, measurements, military proposals, and designs made for a duke whose world required beauty to stand beside power. Chapter 6. The Duke's Engineer. Milan gave Leonardo a title that Florence had not quite given him. In Florence, he had been trained as a painter and shaped by the workshop habits of Verrocchio, but in Milan he could present himself as something wider and more useful to power. The court of Ludovico Sforza did not need only devotional panels or graceful portraits. It needed devices, plans, entertainments, designs, fortifications, monuments, and forms of practical intelligence that could serve a ruler in peace and war. Leonardo entered that world as a man whose imagination could be made useful, or at least promised as useful, across many fields at once. The word engineer carried a different weight in Leonardo's world than it would in a later age of professional schools, standardized degrees, and printed technical manuals. A Renaissance engineer might design fortifications, advise on canals, make theatrical machines, improve weapons, inspect walls, or devise temporary structures for ceremonies. Knowledge was gathered through apprenticeship, observation, military experience, craft practice, mathematical study, and personal invention. It did not always belong to one profession with hard boundaries. Leonardo fit this looseness well. His mind moved easily from the shape of a body to the shape of a bridge, from the motion of water to the motion of a machine, from painted illusion to mechanical effect. Ludovico Sforza's court gave such movement a purpose. Milan was a powerful state, but power in northern Italy required constant attention. Cities had walls, enemies had claims, soldiers had to be paid, and alliances could change with uncomfortable speed. A ruler who wanted to remain secure had to think about defense, transport, artillery, rivers, roads, and the symbolic confidence of public display. The same court that wanted music and painted beauty also wanted practical advantage. Leonardo's letter to Ludovico had understood that appetite clearly. He offered himself first as a servant of necessity. His military proposals ranged widely. He described bridges that could be carried and placed quickly, methods for removing water from moats, covered vehicles that could protect men, and engines for attack or defense. Some designs were plausible. Others were more speculative. A few later readers have mistaken the drawings for modern machines arriving too early, as if Leonardo had stepped outside his century. It is more accurate and more interesting to see him inside his century, taking its siege warfare, its fortresses, its artillery, and its mechanical traditions, then pushing them through an unusually visual and restless intelligence. The notebooks show the habit of that intelligence. Leonardo wrote in his famous reversed script, moving from right to left across the page. This mirror writing has often been made mysterious, but it was not necessarily meant as a secret code. It may have suited his left-handed movement, kept wet ink from smearing, and formed part of a private working habit rather than an elaborate concealment. The pages themselves do not feel like polished books addressed to a public reader. They feel like working surfaces, drawings, notes, measurements, corrections, fragments, lists of things to investigate, and designs placed beside observations that had caught his eye. On those pages, machines did not stand apart from nature. Leonardo studied pulleys, gears, screws, levers, wheels, springs, and flows of force. But he also studied birds, muscles, water, and light. The connection was not accidental. He wanted to know how things moved. A bridge carried weight. A tendon pulled bone. A stream curved around an obstacle. A wing held the air in motion. This search for the behavior beneath appearances gave his engineering work its special character. Even when a device remained only a drawing, the drawing recorded a mind trying to understand a principle. Milan's canals gave him one important field of attention. The city and its surrounding territory depended on water management for transport, irrigation, mills, and urban function. Canals were not poetic scenery in this world. They were economic instruments, political assets, and technical problems. Leonardo studied locks, currents, embankments, dredging, and the controlled movement of water through channels. His interest in hydraulics belonged partly to practical service, because a ruler could benefit from improved waterways, but it also belonged to his deeper fascination with motion and form. Water was both useful and intellectually inexhaustible. Fortification offered another field. In the 15th century, the spread of gunpowder artillery changed the way walls, towers, and defenses had to be imagined. Tall medieval walls could be vulnerable to cannon. Engineers began thinking about lower, thicker defenses, angled forms, earthworks, and arrangements that could absorb or deflect force. Leonardo's drawings show him exploring fortified plans, bastions, and defensive structures. He was not alone in such work. Many Italian engineers were responding to the same military pressures. His distinction lay in the way he turned technical problems into visual studies, covering pages with forms that seemed to test possibility through drawing. War, in these studies, should not be made thrilling. Leonardo lived in a political world where rulers expected violence to remain available as policy. Cities were taken, alliances failed, mercenary forces changed sides, and dynastic claims could bring foreign armies into Italian territory. An engineer's service belonged to that reality. The gentle painter and the designer of weapons were not two separate men living in contradiction. They were one man working within a society where beauty, defense, ambition, and fear often depended on the same patrons. Court entertainments softened that same relationship without removing it. Leonardo designed devices for festivals, performances, allegorical displays, and spectacles meant to delight visitors and confirm Ludovico's magnificence. These works could involve moving parts, stage effects, costumes, painted settings, music, and symbolic machinery. The skills required were close to those used in engineering. A theatrical heaven that opened during a court performance still needed mechanical understanding. A pageant that transformed a hall into a scene of dynastic glory depended on practical design. Leonardo's imagination was useful because it could make power appear graceful. This is one of the clearest ways to understand his Milanese role. He was not merely producing objects. He was helping produce impressions. A court had to be seen. Its ruler had to be surrounded by signs of order, wealth, learning, strength, and elegance. Machines could move scenery. Paintings could honor devotion or lineage. Monuments could lengthen memory. Fortifications could protect territory. Canals could serve trade and agriculture. All of them, in different registers, belonged to the making of rule. Leonardo's service under Ludovico therefore widened his life, but it also tied his fortunes to the needs of one court. He could think broadly because the court gave him broad problems. He could also be interrupted because the court's priorities changed. A design might be admired and never built. A proposal might remain on paper. A project might wait for money, materials, permission, or political calm. The notebooks preserve many possibilities that never became objects in the world, and this is part of their fascination. They show not a career of finished machines, but a workshop of thought. The practical limits were real. Some of Leonardo's military designs would have been difficult to build with the materials, power sources, or mechanical tolerances available to him. Others belong to a long tradition of imaginative war machines that existed as much in drawings and treatises as in use. The covered vehicle, often compared to a tank for example, is better understood as a Renaissance thought experiment in protected movement than as a direct ancestor of modern armored warfare. To flatten it into prophecy is to miss the more human fact. Leonardo was thinking with the tools and fears of his own century. His engineering also remained inseparable from drawing. Drawing allowed him to hold a machine in thought before any material had been cut. It let him rotate a form, expose an internal mechanism, compare alternatives, and return to a problem after interruption. For a painter, drawing had been the foundation of figure and composition. For the engineer, it became the foundation of possibility. This continuity matters. Leonardo did not leave art behind when he designed machines. He carried the discipline of the artist into technical imagination. Milan rewarded that carrying over because Ludovico's court lived by display as much as administration. The Duke's engineer might advise on water and weapons, but he might also prepare marvels for a wedding celebration or create designs that turned a political ceremony into a memory. Court culture liked invention that could be witnessed, an ingenious device, a surprising transformation, or a theatrical mechanism could make a ruler seem surrounded by mastery over nature and art. Leonardo understood the appeal of such effects, and he had the hand to design them with unusual refinement. Still, the same period reveals a recurring tension in his life. Leonardo's mind was often more fertile than his circumstances were stable. A patron might want completion, while Leonardo's attention moved from one problem to another. A court might ask for service, while his notebooks gathered private questions far beyond the task. He could promise bridges and weapons, then study the curl of water with a patience that belonged to no immediate military need. He could design festive machines while thinking about the general laws of motion. In Milan, his usefulness to power and his independence of mind existed side by side. The result was a new identity, richer and more complicated than the one he had carried from Florence. Leonardo was still a painter, but painting no longer contained the full meaning of his work. He had become a court engineer, a designer of spectacle, a student of water, a maker of technical drawings, and a servant of Ludovico's ambitions. His imagination now had access to larger materials and larger purposes. Soon, one of those purposes would take physical shape on an extraordinary scale, as the Sforza court asked him to honor dynastic memory through a horse so large that even its unfinished form would become part of Leonardo's legend. Chapter 7: Horses, Weapons, and Courtly Splendor. The Sforza horse began as a monument before it became a legend of incompletion. Ludovico Sforza wanted to honor his father, Francesco Sforza, the soldier who had risen to become Duke of Milan and whose power still needed to be remembered in bronze. An equestrian statue was one of the oldest languages of command. A ruler on horseback did not merely appear as a man. He appeared as a figure above ordinary scale, controlling motion, wearing authority, and extending his presence into public space. For Ludovico, such a monument could turn family history into something heavy, visible, and difficult to ignore. Leonardo received the commission in a court that understood the value of magnificence. Milan did not use art only for private devotion or graceful decoration. It used art to strengthen dynastic memory. The Sforza family had not ruled Milan from ancient right. Francesco Sforza had taken power after a career shaped by military service, shifting alliances, and political calculation. His son's need to honor him was also a need to stabilize the family's image. A bronze horse in Milan could say what documents and ceremonies also tried to say, that Sforza rule belonged to the city's continuing order. The scale of the project was extraordinary. Leonardo planned a colossal horse, larger than any equestrian bronze that had been cast since antiquity. The ancient world had left behind models of imperial authority, and Renaissance rulers looked back to those examples with hunger. To make such a horse in bronze required more than artistic confidence. It required calculations of weight, balance, casting, mold making, metal supply, furnace management, and transport. A small error could ruin years of work. A monument of this size asked the artist to become engineer, sculptor, planner, and servant of dynastic ambition at the same time. Leonardo's notebooks show how seriously he studied the horse. He drew legs, shoulders, heads, muscles, movement, and proportions. Horses were familiar animals in the world around him, but a monumental horse required more than familiarity. It had to seem alive without losing structural authority. It had to carry the memory of a dead duke while satisfying the eye of the living court. Every tendon, curve, and posture belonged to a practical question. The figure had to stand, and the bronze had to hold. The horse also drew Leonardo into a tradition that reached beyond Milan. Equestrian monuments had long been tied to power because the horse joined nobility, warfare, command, and public visibility in one form. In Italian cities, the memory of ancient Roman statues mattered. Donatello's monument to Gattamelata in Padua and Verrocchio's monument to Bartolomeo Colleoni in Venice had already shown what Renaissance bronze could do with military memory. Leonardo knew Verrocchio's world intimately, and the Colleoni monument belonged to the larger artistic atmosphere from which he came. In Milan, he was being asked to exceed that inheritance. The clay model eventually became one of the wonders of the court. It was displayed in connection with the marriage celebrations of Emperor Maximilian's niece Bianca Maria Sforza to Ludovico in 1493, a moment when Milan had reason to turn ceremony into political theatre. The model's size alone must have made it memorable. Clay, not bronze, held the promise for the time being. The final casting remained ahead, dependent on money, metal, peace, and the Duke's continuing priorities. For a court, however, even the model could serve. It showed ambition before fulfillment. That fact suits Leonardo's career with unusual precision. He often produced things that existed powerfully between intention and completion. Drawings, cartoons, models, plans, and unfinished surfaces could carry enough invention to influence those who saw them, even when the final work never arrived. The Sforza horse was not a minor delay or an abandoned sketch. It was a vast material promise standing in public or semi-public view, large enough to make the court imagine a bronze future. In clay, Leonardo had already made Ludovico's ambition visible. Courtly splendor surrounded the project. Ludovico's Milan depended on ceremonies, marriages, banquets, processions, music, garments, and carefully staged appearances. Beatrice d'Este, Ludovico's young wife, brought her own prestige and refinement into the court after their marriage. Her presence linked Milan to the cultivated Este world of Ferrara and strengthened the language of magnificence around Ludovico. The court became a place where artists, musicians, poets, engineers, ambassadors, and noble families moved through rooms arranged to make power look natural. Leonardo's work belonged to that choreography. His talents were useful because court splendor required invention at many scales. A festival might need costumes, temporary architecture, painted devices, mechanical effects, emblems, music, and carefully arranged movement. A wedding could become an occasion for a ruler to display order and abundance. A diplomatic visit could be shaped by what guests saw and later reported. Leonardo's designs for entertainments and machines were not separate from politics. They helped make the court memorable, and memory was one of the materials from which power was made. Beatrice d'Este's Milan also reveals the social delicacy of court life. Rank had to be recognized in clothing, seating, gifts, ceremonies, and forms of address. Women of ruling houses carried dynastic meaning through marriage, pregnancy, patronage, and correspondence. A duchess or consort could gather artists, support religious houses, encourage fashions, and influence the tone of a court's public face. Beatrice's life was short, but during Leonardo's Milanese years, she belonged to the environment of elegance, youth, ambition, and display in which his court service unfolded. The Sforza horse stood near another reality. Bronze could become a weapon before it became a monument. The metal required for the final casting was enormous. and Milan's political situation did not remain calm enough for artistic ambition to command all available resources. When war threatened, bronze was needed for cannon. The material that might have preserved Francesco Sforza in equestrian glory could be redirected toward defense. This was not an ironic accident added by later storytellers. It was a plain fact of Renaissance power. Magnificence and war drew from the same stores. Leonardo's title as painter of beauty and designer of war finds one of its clearest expressions here. The same court that asked him to model a magnificent horse also valued him for military and engineering ideas. The same duke who wanted dynastic memory in bronze had to consider artillery, alliances, and invasion. The material world did not separate artistic splendor from political danger. Bronze had to choose its form according to circumstance: monument or cannon, memory or defense. For Leonardo, the loss of the bronze meant more than a technical delay. Years of study, preparation, and expectation could not reach the casting stage. The clay model remained impressive but vulnerable. Clay could show form, but it could not give permanence. It could be damaged by weather, neglect, soldiers, or time. A bronze monument was meant to outlast the patron and the maker. A clay model lived closer to the conditions that surrounded it. Its very grandeur made its fragility more visible. The project's failure was not simply Leonardo's failure. It belonged to the instability of Ludovico's world. A ruler could command artists, but he could not command history to remain still. The Italian states existed within a field of French claims, imperial interests, papal maneuvers, Venetian ambitions, and local rivalries. A large artistic project needed calm, money, materials, and confidence in tomorrow's political order. Milan could provide those things for a while. It could not guarantee them. Even so, the horse was not wasted in the history of Leonardo's mind. His studies of equine anatomy, movement, proportion, casting, and monumental scale entered the larger body of his work. He learned through the attempt. He tested the relation between living form and engineered mass. He considered how a body could be enlarged without becoming stiff, how a monument could command space without losing grace, how technical difficulty and artistic ambition could be made part of the same problem. The final bronze did not appear, but the work left marks in drawings and memory. The court, meanwhile, continued to require splendor. Milanese life under Ludovico could still produce ceremonies, entertainments, and artistic commissions even as danger gathered beyond the court's polished surfaces. This is one reason Leonardo's Milan years feel so rich and so unstable. They contain the Last Supper, the Sforza horse, technical drawings, court entertainments, portraits, engineering studies, and the growing pressure of European politics. A lesser court might have offered him less. A safer world might have allowed more completion. Milan gave him scale, but scale came with exposure. The clay horse remained the great unfinished emblem of this period. It showed what Ludovico wanted to remember, what Leonardo was capable of imagining, and what war could interrupt before beauty hardened into bronze. No finished monument stood to carry Francesco Sforza through the centuries in the form Ludovico had desired. Instead, the story of the uncast horse became part of Leonardo's own memory, a memory of ambition large enough to be seen, studied, admired, and lost. From that vast model and the court that produced it, Leonardo moved toward a different surface, one that would be smaller than a monument, fixed to a wall, and far more fragile than bronze. Chapter 8. The Supper on the Wall. Santa Maria delle Grazie belonged to the Milan that Ludovico Sforza wanted to shape into memory. The Dominican church and convent were not only religious spaces, they were connected to the ruler's dynastic imagination, because Ludovico planned the church as a place where Sforza devotion, family prestige, and burial could meet under sacred authority. Leonardo's work in the refectory entered that setting. It was painted for a room where friars gathered to eat, listen, pray, and live according to the repeated order of convent life. The subject was familiar before Leonardo touched it. The Last Supper had been painted many times in Italian refectories, often placed on the wall where the religious community took its meals beneath the image of Christ and the apostles at table. The theme suited such a room because it joined food, discipline, betrayal, sacrament, and communal memory. A friar eating in silence did so under the sign of another meal, one that Christian tradition placed near the center of salvation history. Leonardo did not invent the subject. His task was to make the old subject newly present. The wall itself mattered from the beginning. Leonardo was not painting a portable panel that could be moved, sold, rehung, or protected more easily. He was working on a large surface in the dining hall of a monastery, fitting figures into an architectural space that had to answer the room around it. The long table in the painting seems almost to continue the order of the refectory. The painted space opens beyond the wall, but it also belongs to the wall's physical limits. In this sense, the work was both image and environment, bound to the life of the room. Leonardo chose the moment after Christ had said that one of those present would betray him. Many earlier Last Supper images had arranged the apostles in a more settled order, with Judas isolated or marked in ways that made the moral structure immediately legible. Leonardo organized the moment differently. He allowed the words to move through the group like a disturbance passing through human bodies. The apostles do not dissolve into chaos. They gather into measured groups, each figure reacting through face, hands, posture, and distance from the central calm of Christ. This arrangement suited Leonardo's deepest gifts as a painter. He was interested in expression before it became theatrical. He knew that a hand could ask, deny, recoil, count, or point before a mouth spoke. In the refectory wall, gestures carry thought across the surface. Some apostles lean inward, others draw back. One turns toward another for explanation. Another opens his hands in surprise. Christ remains at the center, his triangular stillness anchoring the movement around him. The painting's drama does not depend on violent action. It depends on recognition arriving at different speeds. The composition is also an act of discipline. Leonardo had to hold 13 figures across a long horizontal field without letting the image scatter. He grouped the apostles in threes, allowing variety without losing order. The room behind them, with its receding walls and distant windows, gives measured depth to the scene. The table creates a boundary, but not a dead one. Hands, dishes, bread, and gestures interrupt it. Each figure belongs to the whole, yet each carries a distinct response. The result is controlled movement, a quality Leonardo had been seeking since his Florentine years. Judas is handled with particular intelligence. Leonardo does not remove him from the group or place him alone on the viewer's side of the table, as some earlier traditions had done. He remains among the apostles, near enough to belong and marked enough to be read. His hand reaches toward the dish. His face lies in shadow compared with the others. A small bag, associated with his role as keeper of the money, helps identify him without requiring crude separation. Betrayal in this painting sits inside fellowship before it is exposed by consequence. The refectory setting deepened the effect. The friars did not encounter the work as modern museum visitors do, separated by ropes, restoration history, photography, and fame. They lived with it as part of a repeated daily environment. The painted table answered their own tables. The sacred meal faced ordinary meals. The silence of monastic dining met the painted silence after Christ's words. Leonardo's image served devotion, but it also studied the social force of a sentence spoken among companions. A room built for discipline received a painting about disturbance held inside order. Yet the beauty of the Last Supper was tied from the beginning to technical risk. Leonardo did not use the traditional buon fresco method in the strict way, where pigment is applied to wet plaster and becomes chemically bound as the wall dries. Fresco required speed, because each section had to be completed while the plaster remained workable. Leonardo's method was slower and more experimental. He worked on a dry, prepared wall with a mixed technique that allowed greater revision, tonal subtlety, and painterly control. It also left the surface more vulnerable. The choice makes sense when seen through Leonardo's habits. He wanted transitions, delicate modeling, and time to adjust the image. A strict fresco schedule would have forced firmer decisions and quicker execution. The wall at Santa Maria delle Grazie became another place where his desire for refinement pushed against material reality. The same patience that made the figures so alive helped make the painting fragile. His method served the eye before it served endurance. Signs of deterioration appeared early. Already in the 16th century, observers noted that the painting had begun to suffer. Moisture, wall conditions, the experimental technique, later damage, repainting, neglect, and restoration all became part of its history. What many people now call Leonardo's Last Supper is therefore not a simple survival of his original surface. It is a damaged, repaired, reduced, and repeatedly rescued object. Its fame has grown in the presence of loss. The painting reached the world not as an untouched masterpiece, but as a masterpiece that had to be continually saved from disappearance. That damaged condition changes the way the work should be imagined. The original subtlety of Leonardo's hand cannot be fully recovered. Colors have altered. Passages have vanished or been remade. The surface has endured decisions made by restorers in different centuries, each one trying, with the knowledge and limits of the time, to preserve or recover something of what Leonardo had placed there. The painting's history is therefore also a history of looking after damage. It asks the viewer to see both the image and its survival. Ludovico Sforza's presence remains behind the commission. The refectory painting belonged to the same Milanese period that produced the Great Horse Project, court entertainments, engineering studies, and dynastic plans. The Duke's patronage gave Leonardo the chance to work at a scale and seriousness that Florence had not yet fully secured for him. In return, Leonardo's image enriched a religious house tied to Sforza prestige. The painting was devotional, but it was also part of a ruler's world. Even sacred beauty had patrons, walls, and politics around it. For Leonardo, the work brought together several strands of his life. The Florentine discipline of drawing shaped the composition. His study of gesture and expression shaped the apostles. His interest in optics and space shaped the room. His technical restlessness shaped the method. His dependence on court patronage shaped the opportunity. No single part explains the whole. The Last Supper stands where painter, engineer, observer, court servant, and experimenter met on one wall. Its emotional power lies partly in restraint. The scene does not need noise. It does not show the betrayal as a completed act. It shows the moment when knowledge begins to pass from one person to another, and each body receives it differently. Christ's stillness is not emptiness. It is the center around which the human reactions arrange themselves. The apostles are not merely symbols of surprise or fear. They are men caught at the instant when a shared table has become uncertain. The painting also shows how Leonardo could turn theology into human observation without reducing it. The subject remains sacred, but the route into it runs through bodies, faces, hands, and space. This was one of his great strengths. He did not make holiness less serious by studying the mechanics of expression. He made the sacred scene more immediate by understanding how people register shock, denial, loyalty, confusion, and recognition. The divine sentence becomes visible through human motion. While the wall suffered, the image traveled through copies, descriptions, engravings, and memory. Artists studied it even when the original surface had already begun to fail. Its arrangement became one of the most recognizable compositions in Western art. That afterlife depended not only on the painting itself, but on the fact that others copied and carried its design outward. A fragile wall in Milan became a source for countless later images because the structure Leonardo gave it was strong enough to survive even when the material surface weakened. The irony is gentle but unavoidable. Leonardo, who so often struggled to finish, completed here one of the most influential works of his life. And yet the completed work almost immediately began to come apart. The wall held both triumph and failure. It gave the world a vision of controlled human feeling, and it refused to preserve that vision cleanly. In Milan, Leonardo had painted a meal that would outlive the court that sponsored it, but it would do so as a wounded object, dependent on care, copying, restoration, and memory. When the Last Supper was finished, Ludovico's Milan still appeared capable of grandeur. The court could point to monuments planned, churches enriched, entertainments staged, and walls transformed by one of the most remarkable painters in Italy. Yet the same political world that had given Leonardo this opportunity was growing unstable. Beyond the refectory, claims, alliances, and armies were beginning to press more heavily against the Sforza state. The painting remained on its wall, already fragile, while the court around it moved toward a collapse that would scatter Leonardo's Milanese life. Chapter 9. The Fall of Ludovico's Milan. Milan's collapse did not arrive as a single event detached from everything Leonardo had been doing. It came through the same courtly world that had supported his paintings, machines, entertainments, and monuments. Ludovico Sforza had spent years shaping his authority through ceremony, alliance, dynastic memory, and artistic display, yet the political ground beneath him remained less secure than the polished surface of his court suggested. His power depended on family claims, military strength, diplomatic calculation, and the ability to manage rivals inside and outside Italy. Leonardo's Milanese life had grown under that shelter, and when the shelter weakened, his own position weakened with it. Louis XII of France pressed a claim to Milan through the Visconti line, and French ambition turned toward northern Italy with force. Italian politics had long been dense with shifting alliances, but the arrival of large foreign armies changed the scale of danger. Courts that had once balanced one another through diplomacy, marriage, mercenary service, and local war now had to face monarchies with deeper resources. Ludovico had played the game of power with skill for years. He had also helped invite forces into Italian affairs that could not easily be dismissed once they had entered. The French invasion of 1499 placed Milan under pressure that court splendor could not answer. Fortifications, alliances, and military preparations mattered, but so did loyalty, morale, and the willingness of subjects and commanders to endure risk for a ruler whose legitimacy had always required careful maintenance. Ludovico's position began to fail. The city that had offered Leonardo space for grand designs now became a place of uncertainty, where the future of every commission depended on the survival of the regime that had ordered it. A court artist could not stand outside that danger. Patronage was political weather. Leonardo had lived in Milan long enough for his work to become tied to Ludovico's ambitions. The Last Supper belonged to a religious house enriched by Sforza patronage. The Great Horse was meant to honor the Duke's father and secure dynastic memory in bronze. Court entertainments had served the same world of display. Engineering ideas had offered usefulness to that same ruler. These works were not isolated acts of private genius. They were connected to a system of power that now faced disruption from outside and weakness within. The Sforza horse became the most visible casualty of that disruption. The clay model had stood as a promise of future bronze, a vast body of intention waiting for the materials and calm needed to complete it. Bronze that might have served the monument had already been drawn toward military need. As the French entered Milan, the project lost the political protection that had sustained it. The model, enormous and vulnerable, remained behind as a thing too large to carry and too fragile to defend with the permanence Leonardo had intended. Later accounts describe French soldiers damaging the clay horse, using it as a target, and reducing the great model to ruin. The details come through the memory of conquest and loss, but the larger fact is clear enough. The monument never became bronze. Francesco Sforza did not ride through Milan in the form Ludovico had imagined. Leonardo's years of study, measurement, and preparation did not harden into the public object for which they had been made. What survived were drawings, references, and the story of a colossal work overtaken by politics. There is a particular sadness in that kind of loss, because the project had already partly existed. It was not only an idea in a notebook. It had occupied space. People had seen it. The court had used it as evidence of ambition. Its very incompletion made it vulnerable, because clay could command attention without commanding survival. Leonardo had turned dynastic memory into form, but the form still waited for metal. War made the waiting permanent. Ludovico fled, returned briefly, and was eventually captured by the French in 1500. His fall carried the harshness of Renaissance politics without needing dramatic embellishment. A ruler who had once filled Milan with ceremony, patronage, and calculated magnificence ended his life as a prisoner in France. For Leonardo, the fall of Ludovico did not mean the fall of his own name, but it did mean the end of the first great courtly environment in which his many abilities had found room. Milan had allowed him to be more than a painter. Now that world was broken. Leonardo left Milan with assistants, possessions, and papers. Among those connected with him was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, better known as Salai, the troublesome and long-serving pupil who had entered Leonardo's household as a boy in the 1490s. Salai's nickname, meaning something like Little Devil, came from Leonardo's own notes about his behavior, including theft, lying, and appetite for mischief. Yet he remained with Leonardo for many years. Such details give the household a more human texture than the polished legend of the solitary master. Leonardo's life was full of papers and ideas, but also of pupils, expenses, annoyances, loyalties, and practical movement from place to place. The notebooks mattered especially in this movement. They were portable in a way the horse was not. A wall painting remained on its wall, subject to moisture, time, and occupation. A clay model could be damaged by soldiers or neglect. Papers could be gathered, packed, carried, misplaced, preserved, or later dispersed. Leonardo's future depended partly on what could travel with him. His thoughts on machines, anatomy, water, architecture, geometry, and painting left Milan as sheets and bound gatherings rather than as completed public works. The departure also changed the rhythm of his career. In Milan, he had lived for years under one dominant patronage structure, even if the work itself varied widely. After the fall, he entered a more unsettled period of movement between courts and cities. Mantua, Venice, and Florence would each appear as possible places of employment or refuge. Requests would follow him because his reputation had grown. Stability would not follow as easily. He had become famous enough to be desired and difficult enough to frustrate desire. The French occupation did not erase Leonardo's Milanese achievements. The Last Supper remained in the refectory, already suffering materially but secure in its imaginative force. His technical studies from the period continued in his papers. The memory of the horse survived precisely because it had failed on such a large scale. Milan had given him years of expansion, and those years could not be undone by Ludovico's defeat. Still, the context had changed. A patron's fall could turn active projects into remnants almost overnight. This was one of the lessons Renaissance Italy taught repeatedly. Artists depended on political arrangements that could appear permanent while remaining fragile. A chapel might outlast a ruling family. A portrait might survive a marriage alliance that lost meaning. A monument might fail because bronze became canon. A notebook might endure because it could be carried away when a court collapsed. Leonardo's life after Milan would be shaped by this uneven survival of things. Some fixed, some ruined, some unfinished, some portable enough to escape. For Leonardo personally, the loss of Milan meant more than displacement. It interrupted the setting in which his identity had widened most fully. He had arrived as a Florentine offering engineering, military devices, architecture, sculpture, and painting. He left as a man whose reputation had been enlarged by precisely that range. The court had let him imagine on a grand scale. It had also shown him that grand scale required political fortune. Without the Duke, the great horse had no future. Without stable patronage, even the most powerful imagination had to seek another room in which to work. Milan itself remained a place to which Leonardo would later return under changed circumstances, but the first Milanese period had ended. Its ending did not close his life. It broke one arrangement and forced another. The painter of the Last Supper, the designer of the Sforza horse, the engineer of canals and machines, the maker of courtly marvels, and the keeper of restless notebooks now had to move through Italy with a reputation both strengthened and unsettled. He had lost a patron, but not his appetite for service, inquiry, and invention. The road out of Milan carried him away from Ludovico's broken court and toward a different kind of uncertainty. Other rulers and patrons knew his name. Some wanted portraits. Others wanted advice. Cities under threat wanted technical skill. Noble houses wanted the prestige of possessing work from his hand. Leonardo had become too significant to disappear, but not secure enough to rest. After the fall of one court, he entered the wandering middle of his life, where admiration followed him from place to place and completion remained harder than desire. Chapter 10. Between Courts and Commissions. After Milan, Leonardo's life did not settle into one clear new beginning. It loosened into movement. The court that had given him work, scale, and shelter had fallen, and the projects attached to Ludovico Sforza could no longer hold him in place. He was no longer an unknown Florentine apprentice seeking a master's approval. He was a man with a reputation large enough to travel ahead of him, but reputation did not provide a house, a salary, or a finished commission by itself. It opened doors, and then each door had to be negotiated. Mantua was one of the first important stops in this unsettled period. There, Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, wanted something from Leonardo that many people would have wanted from him: a portrait. Isabella was one of the most cultivated and determined patrons of her age, a woman who understood the value of art, letters, music, collecting, and controlled self-presentation. She did not merely desire beautiful things, she desired objects that belonged to a carefully formed identity. A portrait by Leonardo would have served that identity with unusual force. Leonardo made a drawing of Isabella, a profile study that survives as one of the clearest traces of their encounter. It shows her not in the soft frontal mystery later associated with the Mona Lisa, but in a more formal mode connected to courtly portrait tradition. The profile carries authority, restraint, and social distance. Isabella wanted the drawing turned into a painted portrait, and she would continue to press for it through letters and intermediaries. Leonardo did not deliver the completed painting she desired. That failure was not unusual in his life, but Isabella's persistence makes it especially visible. She was not a vague admirer. She was a powerful patron with taste, patience, and influence. Her letters show a familiar pattern around Leonardo: admiration sharpened by frustration. People wanted his work because they believed no one else could quite give them what he could. They also learned that wanting did not guarantee receiving. His fame had begun to acquire a difficult edge. From Mantua, Leonardo moved toward Venice, a city facing its own military concerns. Venice was not a ducal court in the Milanese sense, nor a Florentine republic of the same type as the city of his youth. It was a maritime and territorial power, governed through its own aristocratic institutions and shaped by trade, naval strength, diplomacy, and defense. Around 1500, the Ottoman threat and wider military anxieties made technical advice valuable. Leonardo's usefulness as an engineer could again matter more than his identity as a painter. In Venice, he seems to have offered ideas connected to defense, especially against possible attack. One proposal involved underwater or hydraulic means of damaging enemy vessels, though the details belong to the broader world of Leonardo's technical imagination rather than to a completed military system. Venice's lagoons, channels, and watery approaches made the city a special problem for engineers. It was protected by water, enriched by water, and vulnerable through water. For Leonardo, whose notebooks had long treated water as both force and mystery, the city presented a practical field of thought. The Venetian moment was brief, but it shows how Leonardo's career after Milan kept dividing itself among different kinds of demand. One patron wanted a portrait, another city might want military counsel, another court might value spectacle, another religious or civic body might want a painting. Leonardo could answer all these worlds in theory, and that was part of his power. In practice, moving among them meant that his life rarely narrowed into a predictable profession. Florence drew him back again, but Florence itself had changed. The Medici had been expelled in 1494, and the city had passed through the intense religious and political period associated with Girolamo Savonarola, whose preaching had condemned luxury and called Florence toward moral reform. Savonarola had been executed in 1498, yet the city he left behind was not the same city Leonardo had departed years earlier. Republican institutions, civic anxiety, factional memory, and the need to reassert public identity all shaped the atmosphere into which Leonardo returned. The return placed him near old ground with a changed name. He had trained in Florence as a young man, but now he came back as the painter of the Last Supper, the designer of the Sforza horse, and the court engineer who had served Milan. Florence could no longer see him only as Ser Piero's gifted son or Verrocchio's former apprentice. He had become a figure of wider Italian importance. Even so, the city did not simply hand him peace. It gave him possibilities, rivalries, requests, and public expectations. His father, Ser Piero, was still part of the Florentine world, and Leonardo's family ties remained complicated. Ser Piero had many legitimate children from later marriages, and questions of inheritance and household standing would not favor Leonardo in simple ways. The son born outside marriage had gained a fame none of his legitimate half-siblings could match, but fame did not erase the legal and familial structures into which he had been born. This is one of the quieter continuities in his life. The boy from Vinci had grown famous without becoming ordinary. Florence also brought him back into contact with the demands of painting. Among the works associated with this period, the cartoon of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist drew remarkable attention. A cartoon in this sense was not a humorous image, but a full-scale preparatory drawing, often used to work out a composition before painting. Such drawings could themselves become objects of admiration. Leonardo's large designs allowed people to see invention before completion, and sometimes invention was all they received. The power of the cartoon lay in the way it revealed Leonardo thinking at scale. Figures turned into one another through gesture and relation. The bodies did not merely occupy space, they seemed to form a living knot of affection, theology, and movement. Such a drawing could attract viewers because it carried the freshness of creation without the closure of a finished painting. It also demonstrated again how Leonardo's unfinished work could shape reputation. People could be moved by what he intended almost as strongly as by what he completed. Patrons, however, could not live on intention forever. A drawing might astonish, but a chapel needed its altarpiece. A noble woman wanted her portrait, a civic body expected delivery, and payment usually belonged to agreed work. Leonardo's middle years increasingly show this tension between visible brilliance and practical incompletion. He was no fraud, and he was not indifferent to work. The problem was more difficult than laziness. His attention entered subjects so deeply that the commission could become only one part of a much larger inquiry. This period also gave him time to pursue mathematics and natural studies with renewed seriousness. Luca Pacioli, the mathematician with whom Leonardo had associated in Milan, had already strengthened his interest in geometry and proportion. Mathematical order mattered to artists because perspective, architecture, bodies, and design could all be understood through measure. For Leonardo, measure did not reduce beauty, it gave beauty another form of intelligibility. A visible thing became more compelling when its underlying relations could be studied. Movement between courts and cities sharpened this habit of collecting problems. In one place, he considered a portrait; in another, defenses; in another, sacred figures; elsewhere, canals, maps, machines, or public images. His notebooks became the one territory that remained continuously his own. Patrons could own a commission, rulers could control a court, cities could rise or fall, and walls could deteriorate. The notebooks allowed Leonardo to carry questions across all of them. Yet notebooks did not solve the need for patronage. Leonardo still required employment, protection, and payment. His reputation made him desirable, but it also made him harder to manage, because the greater the expectation around him, the more noticeable every delay became. Isabella d'Este's unfulfilled portrait request was not a minor footnote. It represented a pattern that important patrons could recognize. Leonardo could give evidence of genius quickly, then withhold completion for years or forever. The years after Milan therefore form a restless middle passage. They do not have the concentrated courtly coherence of his first Milanese period, nor the late softness of France. They are marked by movement, negotiation, and searching. Leonardo was neither rising simply nor declining. He was carrying fame through unstable political space, trying to attach his abilities to circumstances that would let them unfold. Each city offered something. No city yet offered enough. From Mantua's portrait hopes to Venice's defensive anxieties and Florence's altered republican stage, Leonardo's life after Ludovico became a life between demands. He had learned that beauty could serve courts, that machines could serve rulers, and that drawings could hold possibilities long before matter obeyed them. Now he moved among patrons who wanted possession of his gifts, while his mind continued to range beyond any one request. This wandering would soon bring him into the service of one of the most feared political figures in Italy, where maps, roads, fortresses, and power would again draw the painter toward the machinery of rule. Chapter 11. Cesare Borgia's Mapmaker. Cesare Borgia entered Leonardo's life through the hard politics of central Italy. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and for a brief period he seemed capable of turning papal family ambition into territorial rule. Cities, fortresses, roads, governors, commanders, and uncertain loyalties lay across the Romagna, where his authority had to be imposed, measured, inspected, and made visible. Leonardo had already served Ludovico Sforza in Milan as painter, engineer, designer, and maker of courtly devices. Under Cesare, his usefulness moved again toward the practical needs of power. In 1502, Leonardo received a formal appointment from Cesare Borgia as architect and general engineer. The document gave him authority to inspect fortresses and works throughout Borgia's territories, and it instructed officials to grant him access and assistance. This mattered. Leonardo was not merely wandering through the Romagna as a curious observer. He was traveling with the backing of a ruler who wanted information. Gates, walls, roads, rivers, and towns were not picturesque subjects in this service. They were parts of government. Caesar's state was still being made. The Romagna had long contained cities and lordships with their own histories, rival families, local resentments, and habits of resistance. To rule such a region required more than victory. A ruler had to know where roads ran, where walls were weak, where rivers could hinder movement, how towns related to one another, and which places could be held or lost under pressure. Leonardo's appointment placed his eye in the service of this kind of knowledge. He was asked to see territory as something that could be administered. The work suited him in ways that were both technical and personal. Leonardo had always been drawn to the relation between visible form and hidden structure. A body had muscles beneath skin, a river had currents beneath surface, a city had roots, defenses, gates, measurements, and vulnerabilities beneath its appearance. Mapping allowed him to translate that habit into political use. Instead of painting a town as it might look from a hillside, he could draw it as a ruler needed to understand it. The most remarkable surviving example from this period is his map of Imola. Rather than presenting the city through a decorative or symbolic view, Leonardo arranged it with striking overhead clarity. Streets, walls, towers, gates, and blocks appear as if the city has been opened to the eye from above. The map reflects measurement, walking, checking, and disciplined abstraction. It turns inhabited space into usable form. For Cesare Borgia, such a map could help make possession more exact. For Leonardo, it showed that drawing could serve knowledge without becoming painting. Imola mattered because it was not simply represented, it was organized. Leonardo's map gave the city a kind of administrative legibility. A ruler or commander could study relations among streets and defenses without relying only on memory or local report. This was a different beauty from the beauty of a face or a sacred scene. It was the beauty of precision. Lines, angles, and distances carried authority because they reduced confusion. The city became less like a place one entered and more like a structure one could command. This kind of mapping required labor that is easy to overlook. Leonardo had to gather measurements, compare directions, note the relation of gates and roads, and convert movement through streets into an ordered drawing. No single glance could give him the map. It had to be assembled through procedure. The finished sheet hides the physical effort behind it. Walking, observing, checking, returning, correcting, and making the disorder of experience answer to the discipline of the page. Niccolò Machiavelli moved in the same political world during these years. He was serving the Florentine Republic and encountered Cesare Borgia's rise with the alertness of a man whose later writings would turn political observation into a severe art. Leonardo and Machiavelli were not identical minds. One studied power partly through machines, maps, bodies, and visual systems. The other studied it through offices, armies, fear, loyalty, and the behavior of rulers. Yet both were present in an Italy where politics had become a school of close observation. Cesare himself impressed many observers because he seemed, for a time, to possess the qualities needed for ruthless state-building. He moved through the Romagna with force, calculation, and theatrical authority. His violence does not need vivid description here. What matters for Leonardo's story is that Cesare's government required instruments of control. Engineers, maps, inspectors, military advisors, and administrators helped turn conquest into rule. Leonardo's service placed him within that machinery, even if his temperament remained more investigative than political. The appointment also shows how far Leonardo had traveled from the workshop door in Florence. He had once learned to prepare panels, study drapery, and serve a master's commissions. Now he carried papers that opened fortresses to his inspection. His hand, trained for angels, portraits, and sacred figures, could also draw walls and roads for a ruler whose power depended on obedience. The distance between beauty and war had narrowed again, not as a dramatic contradiction, but as a condition of his employment. Travel through the Romagna gave Leonardo fresh material for his notebooks. Roads, rivers, elevations, and fortifications belonged to the same field of attention as machines and waterworks. He was not collecting impressions loosely. He was gathering information. A road could be measured. A river crossing could be considered. A fortress could be assessed. A city could be drawn in plan. His curiosity remained intense, but Cesare's service gave it a directed political function. The Romagna itself was a landscape of control and uncertainty. Towns could submit and resist. Local elites could cooperate while waiting for better conditions. Fortresses were not merely stone structures. They were statements about who held the surrounding land. Roads mattered because troops, messengers, officials, and supplies had to move through them. In such a region, knowledge of space was not neutral. To map a place for a ruler was to participate in the ruler's effort to possess it. Leonardo's service under Cesare did not last long. The same instability that made Borgia's rise so striking also made it vulnerable. His authority depended heavily on the position of his father, Pope Alexander VI, and on political circumstances that could change quickly. When Alexander died in 1503, Caesare's fortunes began to fall. The machinery of his power, which had seemed so formidable for a brief time, could not preserve itself once its central support weakened. Leonardo's appointment belonged to that short interval when Borgia rule still appeared to be taking shape. The brevity of the service does not make it minor. It gave Leonardo one of the clearest occasions to apply drawing, engineering, and observation directly to territorial power. It also produced the Imola map, a work that belongs as much to the history of information as to the history of art. Modern viewers, used to maps from above, may miss how striking such a representation could be. Leonardo was helping create a way of seeing a city that no ordinary human eye could occupy, a view assembled by measurement and intelligence. That overhead view has a quiet importance in his larger life. Leonardo often wanted to escape the limits of ordinary position. He studied birds because they suggested another relation to air and earth. He studied anatomy because the body's surface did not satisfy him. He studied water because its visible movement concealed laws of flow. In mapping Imola, he again sought a view beyond the immediate eye. The city had to be known from a position no standing observer could naturally hold. After Caesar's decline, Leonardo moved away from that service, but the experience remained part of his development. He had seen another form of patronage, harsher and more mobile than Ludovico's court. Milan had offered splendor, dynastic monument, religious commission, and technical possibility. Caesar offered inspection, mapping, military architecture, and the urgent needs of a state still being forced into shape. Both worlds used Leonardo because he could make thought visible. Both also showed him that power was never still for long. The path from Borgia's Romagna led him back toward Florence and toward one of the great public commissions of his career. The city of his youth now wanted art on a civic scale, and Leonardo would be asked to paint battle for a republic that needed memory as much as decoration. Near him, another Florentine artist, younger and more combative, would receive a rival wall. Leonardo's years among courts, machines, maps, and rulers were about to return to the public language of painting, but the subject would still be war. Chapter 12. Florence, Rivalry, and the Battle Wall. Florence brought Leonardo back to the public language of painting, but not to the sheltered world of his youth. The city he returned to in the early 16th century had passed through political rupture, religious severity, Medici exile, Republican experiment, and the uneasy work of rebuilding civic confidence. Its leaders needed images that could do more than decorate. They needed images that could speak of memory, courage, order, and collective identity inside a republic still defining itself after years of strain. Leonardo had learned in Milan and Romagna that art could serve rulers. In Florence, he would be asked to serve a city. The room at the center of this service was the great council hall in the Palazzo della Signoria. It was a political space, not a private chapel or courtly chamber. Decisions, representation, and republican authority gathered there under the eyes of citizens and officials. To decorate such a hall was to give visual form to civic memory. Florence wanted to remember battles that showed its strength and endurance, and those memories had to be made large enough to stand beside the scale of government itself. A wall in that room was not neutral surface, it was public argument in plaster and paint. Leonardo received the commission to paint the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory from 1440. The event belonged to the city's military memory, but Leonardo approached it through a concentrated struggle rather than through a broad, orderly panorama. The surviving evidence, including copies and preparatory studies, suggests that his central image focused on the fight for a standard, with men and horses compressed into a violent knot of force, anger, and strain. He did not need to show an entire battlefield to make battle legible. A few bodies, bound together by motion and fury, could carry the meaning of conflict. Michelangelo, much younger and already formidable, was assigned the rival subject of the Battle of Cassina for another wall in the same hall. The pairing has become one of the great imagined confrontations in art history. Leonardo and Michelangelo, two Florentines of immense power, facing one another across civic space. The reality was less clean than legend, because neither project reached completion in the way Florence intended. Yet the rivalry mattered because contemporaries understood that two different visions of the human body, movement, and artistic authority had been placed near each other. Leonardo was in his early 50s. Michelangelo was not yet 30. The difference in age was also a difference in artistic temperament. Leonardo's figures often emerged through transition, shadow, psychological movement, and the soft passage between forms. Michelangelo's bodies asserted themselves with muscular force, sculptural compression, and a harder sense of physical will. Florence, by placing them in the same civic project, created a comparison that neither man fully controlled. The hall became a place where the Republic's memory of battle met the rivalry of two artistic languages. Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere of Florence, stood behind the civic ambition of the Commission. His government needed grandeur, and grandeur in a republic had to be handled differently from grandeur in a court. Ludovico Sforza could use monuments to honor dynastic rule. Florence needed images that seemed to belong to the city itself. A battle painting in the Great Council Hall could turn past victory into present legitimacy. The Republic could look at its own history and find there a claim to courage, unity, and endurance. Leonardo's preparatory work shows how intensely he studied the problem. Horses twist, heads pull back, mouths open, teeth show, and men lean into the struggle with almost animal concentration. The famous central group, known through later copies such as the one associated with Rubens, gives battle as collision rather than pageantry. This was not courtly tournament grace, it was the breakdown of order into force. Leonardo, who had advertised military devices to Ludovico and mapped cities for Cesare Borgia, now turned war back into painting, but without making it noble in any simple way. His horses are especially important. Years of studying the Sforza monument had taught him to think of equine bodies as structures of motion, power, fear, and balance. In the Battle of Anghiari, the horse is not merely a mount carrying a human actor. It becomes part of the event's force. Neck, eye, mouth, muscle, and turned head all participate in the struggle. Leonardo's knowledge of animals, mechanics, and expression converged in the same bodies. The battle wall drew from the horse that never became bronze. The subject also allowed him to explore the passions, a term Renaissance artists and writers used for movements of the soul expressed through the body. Anger, fear, greed, determination, and confusion had to become visible without reducing figures to masks. Leonardo had long been interested in how inward states show themselves through face and gesture. A battle gave him the most extreme field for that study. Hands grasped, eyes strained, mouths tightened, and bodies pushed against one another in a compressed grammar of conflict. Michelangelo's rival cartoon for the Battle of Cassina approached war differently. It reportedly showed Florentine soldiers surprised while bathing, called suddenly back to arms. The subject gave him a field for the nude male body in twisting, rising, urgent movement, where Leonardo concentrated on mounted struggle and the seizure of a standard. Michelangelo displayed bodies as engines of muscular response. Young artists came to study both cartoons, and the two unfinished projects became a school before they became a loss. Florence received, for a brief time, not completed walls, but visible invention at full scale. The cartoons themselves mattered enormously. A cartoon was made for transfer, but it could also become an object of admiration, study, and competition. Artists could gather around such a drawing to learn composition, anatomy, movement, and expressive force. Leonardo's and Michelangelo's cartoons did not merely prepare paintings. They entered Florentine artistic memory as events in themselves. The unfinished state of the projects made the preparatory works even more important, because they carried the invention that the walls failed to preserve. Leonardo's attempt to execute the wall painting returned him to the technical restlessness that had shaped the Last Supper. He did not use a straightforward fresco method. Sources suggest he experimented with a technique involving heat and oil-based materials, hoping for the kind of tonal richness and working time that fresco did not easily allow. The result failed. The paint did not properly secure itself as intended, and the work began to suffer before it could be completed. Once again, Leonardo's desire for a particular visual effect pressed against the obedience of materials. This failure has often been treated as part of his legend of incompletion, but it deserves a more exact place. Leonardo was not unable to imagine the work. He imagined it with force. He was not unable to draw it. The surviving studies and copies show invention of extraordinary power. The failure lay in the passage from invention to durable public execution under the conditions of a wall, a commission, and a chosen method. For patrons and officials, that distinction may not have mattered very much. A failed wall remained a failed wall. Machiavelli's presence near this world adds another layer. As a Florentine official, he was involved in the Republic's military and administrative concerns, and he belonged to the same civic environment that wanted public images of martial memory. His later writings would ask how states preserve themselves, how citizen armies differ from mercenaries, and how rulers or republics survive in a dangerous world. Leonardo's battle painting did not argue those questions in words. It gave the body's answer to war, strain, compression, appetite, fear, and force bound into one image. Florence's commission, therefore, gathered many strands of Leonardo's life. The workshop training of his youth gave him drawing. Milan gave him knowledge of courtly ambition and horses on a monumental scale. Cesare Borgia's service gave him direct experience of military geography and the needs of power. His notebooks gave him studies of motion, expression, anatomy, and mechanics. On the wall of the great council hall, these strands met in a civic project that asked him to turn battle into memory. The request was public, but the problems were intensely his own. Michelangelo eventually left for other work, and Leonardo's wall remained unfinished. The Republic did not receive the completed visual program it had imagined. Later changes to the hall and later artistic campaigns would obscure, replace, or erase what had been there. Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari became a lost work known through studies, copies, descriptions, and rumor. Its absence has become part of its fame. The painting that failed to survive has held attention for centuries because the fragments suggest a force that the completed wall might have carried. The rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo should not be inflated into a theatrical duel, but it should not be dismissed either. They represented different generations and different understandings of the body. Michelangelo's art pressed towards sculptural power, heroic strain, and the grandeur of form under pressure. Leonardo's pressed toward movement, atmosphere, expression, and the hidden causes of visible life. Florence briefly placed both visions in the same room. The room did not keep them, but the comparison remained. For Leonardo, the failure of the battle wall added another unfinished monument to his life. The Sforza horse had remained clay. The Last Supper had survived in damaged form. Isabella's portrait had remained a request. Now the Battle of Anghiari entered the company of works that were powerful partly because they were incomplete, damaged, or lost. This pattern would have frustrated patrons, and understandably so. Yet it also means that Leonardo's influence often traveled through traces, drawings, copies, stories, fragments, and the memory of what others had seen before disappearance. Florence had asked him to paint victory. What it received was something less useful to civic pride, but perhaps more revealing. A vision of battle as a struggle in which men and animals lose the calm arrangements that public memory usually gives them. Leonardo's war was not clean triumph. It was force tightening around a standard, bodies bent by appetite and fear, horses made almost human in their distress. The man who had painted beauty in Milan and designed machines for rulers had brought war onto a Florentine wall, and even in failure, the image left behind a reputation that no completed official program could entirely contain. Chapter 13. The Face That Would Not Leave Him. The portrait now known as the Mona Lisa did not begin as the most famous painting in the world. It began, as far as the strongest evidence suggests, in Florence, within the ordinary social world of marriage, family standing, and portraiture. The sitter is usually identified as Lisa Gherardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a Florentine silk merchant. Her name, her household, and her likely connection to the commission place the painting back into the city from which later mystery has often tried to lift it. Before it became an icon, it belonged to a family, a city, and a painter's working life. Lisa Gherardini was born into an old but not especially wealthy Florentine family, and her marriage to Francesco del Giocondo connected her to a prosperous merchant household. Florentine portraits often served purposes that were both private and social. They could mark marriage, fertility, family continuity, prosperity, or the dignity of a household that wanted its place remembered. A woman's portrait was rarely only a likeness in the modern personal sense. It belonged to kinship, property, alliance, and domestic honor. Leonardo's painting entered this world before it entered the long afterlife of museums, reproductions, theories, and crowds. The commission is commonly connected to the early 1500s, after Leonardo's return to Florence. Giorgio Vasari, writing later in the 16th century, identified the sitter as Lisa, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, and described Leonardo working on the portrait for years. Vasari's account has to be read with care, as all later biographical writing does, but in this case it is supported by other evidence that makes the identification persuasive. The painting's Italian name, La Gioconda, preserves the connection to the Giocondo family, while also carrying the pleasing echo of a joyful or serene woman. Names can gather meanings long after the first commission has passed. Leonardo did not treat the portrait as a simple record of features. The sitter is placed in a seated pose, turned gently toward the viewer, with hands resting in the foreground and a distant landscape unfolding behind her. The arrangement gives her presence without stiffness. Her body has weight, but the contours soften into the air around her. Her hands are calm, carefully observed, and almost architectural in their quiet placement. The face is neither openly smiling nor solemn. It seems to hold expression at the threshold where certainty becomes difficult. That difficulty has made the painting vulnerable to excess explanation. Later viewers have searched the smile as if it were a locked message, a confession, a code, a secret self-portrait, a medical sign, or a philosophical riddle. The more famous the painting became, the more heavily it was asked to bear. Yet the work's power does not require the sitter to hide a dramatic secret. Leonardo was deeply interested in the unstable edges of expression. A face interested him most, where motion had nearly settled, but not fully stopped. The Mona Lisa holds that passing interval with unusual delicacy. The technique that allows this effect is often called sfumato, the soft, smoky transition between tones that avoids hard outlines. Leonardo built form through subtle gradations of light and shadow, letting boundaries blur without dissolving the structure beneath them. The eyelids, corners of the mouth, cheeks, and shadows around the face participate in this delicacy. The expression changes because the painting refuses to declare itself in sharp lines. Looking at it from one distance or another, under one condition or another, a viewer may feel that the face has shifted, though the paint remains still. This was not an accident of charm. It belonged to Leonardo's long study of optics, anatomy, and the behavior of light. He understood that seeing is not only the reception of a fixed object, but a process shaped by distance, shadow, angle, and the eye itself. In the Mona Lisa, his painterly method makes that process visible. The portrait does not shout its complexity, it lets uncertainty occur through the smallest transitions. A line that another painter might have sharpened, Leonardo allowed to breathe into shadow. The landscape behind Lisa adds another strangeness. It does not behave like a simple view from a Florentine window. Roads, waters, bridges, rocks, and distant forms recede into an imagined or transformed terrain that feels older and less domestic than the sitter's immediate world. Leonardo had spent years studying water, geology, erosion, and the structure of the earth. The background seems to place a merchant's wife before a world of vast natural processes. Her body is near, composed, and socially legible. Behind her, the earth opens into distance and time. Yet the painting remains a portrait. It should not be turned entirely into an allegory of nature or knowledge. Lisa's folded hands, dark garment, veil, and seated composure belong to the conventions and expectations of her age. Her presentation carries modesty and status rather than theatrical display. Leonardo did not remove her from her social world. He deepened that world by allowing the individual presence, the painter's science of seeing, and the imagined landscape to coexist without explanation. The result is intimate and remote at once. Raphael's early portrait drawings suggest that Leonardo's Florentine experiments in portraiture were noticed by younger artists. Raphael, who came to Florence in the first decade of the 16th century, absorbed lessons from Leonardo's arrangements, especially the seated figure turned within a balanced composition. Influence did not require possession of the finished painting. A cartoon, an unfinished panel, a drawing, or even access to a work in progress could alter the direction of another artist's thought. Leonardo's unfinished or retained works often entered the world this way, by being seen before they were delivered, or seen by artists even when patrons waited. The question of why Leonardo kept the Mona Lisa has become part of its story. If the painting was commissioned by Francesco del Giocondo, it does not appear to have passed quickly into the family's hands. Leonardo seems to have carried it with him for years, eventually taking it to France. Several explanations are possible. It may have remained unfinished in his judgment. He may have continued refining it because it served his own investigations. The patron may not have received it for reasons now lost. Whatever the cause, the painting became a companion of his later life rather than a settled transaction. This long retention changes the meaning of the work. A commissioned portrait normally belongs to the sitter's family and purpose. Leonardo's portrait, by staying with him, also became part of his private workshop of inquiry. He could return to it, adjust it, study it, and preserve it among the objects that mattered to his own development. The face that would later become public beyond measure spent years in a more intimate relation to the painter's hand. Its fame began with delay. The delay also fits the pattern that patrons found so difficult. Isabella d'Este wanted a portrait and did not receive the finished object she desired. The monks of San Donato had received an unfinished adoration. Florence battle wall had failed. The Sforza horse had remained clay. In this company, the Mona Lisa is unusual because the incompletion, if it was incompletion, did not prevent survival. Instead of being lost on a wall or abandoned in a commission, it stayed with Leonardo and crossed borders. The work survived partly because it did not go where it may originally have been expected to go. The portrait's later fame can make it hard to recover the Leonardo who painted it. He was not painting for a line of museum visitors. He was working in a world of patrons, family identity, artistic rivalry, technical experiment, and private study. He had already seen a court collapse, a monument fail, and a wall painting suffer. He had mapped towns for Cesare Borgia and studied machines for dukes. The hand that softened Lisa's mouth had also drawn fortifications, weapons, horses, bodies, and water. The tenderness of the portrait did not come from a life protected from harsher subjects. It came from the same eye that studied them. This is part of the painting's quiet force. It contains no weapon, no machine, no battle, no ruler, and no obvious drama. Yet it was made by a man whose life had been spent near all those things. Leonardo's genius, if the word is used carefully, did not consist only in range. It consisted in the ability to bring extreme patience to a small transition. The corner of a mouth could receive the same seriousness as a machine. A hand at rest could matter as much as a horse in motion. a portrait could become a study of perception itself. As Leonardo's life moved onward, the Mona Lisa moved with him. Its surface gathered his time, his delays, his revisions, and his refusal to let the face settle into a single, easy reading. The woman connected to Francesco del Giocondo remained anchored in Florentine social life, but the painting carrying her likeness entered Leonardo's more wandering existence. It belonged to a household and exceeded that household. It belonged to portrait tradition and exceeded portrait tradition. It belonged to a painter who was already turning more of his attention toward bodies, waters, machines, and the hidden structures beneath visible life. Chapter 14. Bodies, Waters, and Flying Things. Leonardo's notebooks form a second life beside the public one. Paintings, commissions, patrons, and courts carried his name through the world, but the notebooks carried the motion of his mind more closely. They were not finished treatises prepared for readers. They were working places crowded with drawings, measurements, questions, diagrams, corrections, lists, and observations. On one page, a machine might appear beside a study of water. On another, the bones of a hand might share space with notes on movement, proportion, or light. The order was not the order of a printed book. It was the order of inquiry. Anatomy drew him with special force. Artists had long studied the body in order to paint and sculpt it more convincingly, but Leonardo's interest moved beyond surface usefulness. He wanted to understand what lay beneath skin, how bones joined, how muscles pulled, how tendons worked, how the skull housed the senses, how the heart moved blood, how expression began in structure. This did not make him a physician in the ordinary professional sense. It made him a painter whose questions about visible life carried him into the hidden machinery of the body. Dissection was difficult work in his age, not only physically but socially and institutionally. Access to bodies depended on hospitals, permissions, circumstances, and the practical realities of death in cities. Leonardo worked at times in hospitals and medical settings where such study was possible, including in Florence, Milan, and later Rome. The subject must be handled without lingering on the body as spectacle. For Leonardo, the body was not a curiosity cabinet of horrors. It was a structure to be understood with patience, line, and measurement. His anatomical drawings show an extraordinary union of hand and investigation. He drew bones with clarity, muscles with layered attention, and organs with an effort to show not only their appearance but their relation to function. A shoulder was not merely rounded form. It was an arrangement of bone, tendon, and force. A hand was not merely graceful fingers. It was a system of small bones and controlled motion. The face was not only expression. It was a surface moved by muscles, nerves, habit, and feeling. The collaboration with Marcantonio della Torre deepened this work. Marcantonio was a young professor of anatomy at Pavia, and his association with Leonardo offered the possibility of joining medical learning to visual genius. Their plans may have included a systematic anatomical treatise, though death interrupted the possibility. Marcantonio died young, probably during the plague years around 1511. What remained was not the completed book that might have changed the history of anatomy more immediately, but a body of drawings and notes that later generations would recognize as astonishingly advanced in observation and presentation. Leonardo's studies of the heart deserve particular attention. He examined valves, chambers, flow, and motion with a seriousness that separated him from artists who studied anatomy only for outer form. He understood that the heart's structure had to be read dynamically, as something shaped by movement rather than as a static object. He studied the way valves opened and closed, the way fluid might curl and press, and the way form served function. In this field, as in so many others, water helped him think. Water was one of his lifelong subjects. It appeared in landscapes, engineering plans, canal studies, flood reflections, and drawings of currents. Leonardo watched how it moved around obstacles, how it fell, how it swirled, how it carried silt, how it wore down earth, and how it could be directed for human use. Rivers were never only rivers to him. They were moving bodies with habits, resistance, force, and memory. His studies of water belonged both to practical engineering and to natural philosophy, though he would not have divided those categories as sharply as later centuries might. In Milan and elsewhere, water had direct use. Canals carried goods, supported agriculture, and shaped urban life. Locks and channels raised questions of level, pressure, flow, and control. A ruler might value a man who understood such matters, because waterworks could enrich territory and strengthen cities. Leonardo's notebooks include designs and observations related to canals, drainage, mills, and hydraulic devices. The same hand that shaded a cheek could trace the path of a current through a channel. Yet his fascination with water went beyond utility. He saw analogies between water and hair, between currents and motion, between eddies and living forms. A curl of hair and a curl of water both gave him visible evidence of underlying movement. This was not metaphor for its own sake, it was a way of seeing repeated patterns across different parts of nature. Leonardo looked for families of motion. He wanted to know whether the world's surfaces might be connected by laws that drawing could uncover. Flight drew him with the same mixture of practicality and wonder, though he never produced a working flying machine. Birds had been available to his eye since childhood, but in the notebooks their motion became a technical problem. Wings had structure, air offered resistance. A body needed balance, lift, and control. Leonardo studied the movement of birds, the spread of feathers, the relation of body weight to wing surface, and the possibility of mechanical imitation. His drawings of flying devices are often remembered because they seem to point toward a future age of aircraft. But their true place is inside his own age's effort to understand motion through analogy, craft, and observation. The machines he drew for flight range from winged devices moved by human effort to more elaborate constructions that studied air as a medium. Some would never have worked as imagined. Human muscle could not supply what several of the designs required. Materials available to him imposed their own limits. Still, the failure to fly does not make the inquiry foolish. Leonardo was trying to translate the motion of living creatures into mechanical possibility. He was asking what nature did before technology knew how to answer. His notebooks on flight also show the discipline of looking before building. He studied birds landing, rising, turning, and holding themselves in air. He understood that flight was not merely flapping, it involved balance, pressure, angle, and adjustment. A bird's wing was not a flat instrument. It changed shape. Its feathers altered the passage of air. Its body responded constantly to invisible force. Such observations show why Leonardo's drawings remain compelling even when the machines were impractical. They record a mind trying to take nature seriously before imitating it. Optics formed another part of this same inquiry into appearances. Leonardo cared about how sight worked, how light struck objects, how shadows softened, how distance altered color, and how the eye received form. His painting cannot be separated from this work. The sfumato of the Mona Lisa, the atmospheric depth of landscapes, the subtle modeling of flesh, and the spatial order of the Last Supper all depend on a mind that studied seeing itself. He did not treat vision as passive. The eye, light, air, surface, and distance all participated in the making of what appeared. This interest in optics brought him near questions that artists, mathematicians, and natural philosophers had all considered. Perspective had already transformed Italian painting, but Leonardo's concern extended into the behavior of light and shadow in the visible world. A distant mountain did not look like a nearby stone. Air itself seemed to stand between the eye and the object. Edges softened, colors cooled or faded, forms lost sharpness. Such observations entered painting as beauty, but they began as attention to the conditions of sight. Geology and the history of the earth also entered his thought. Leonardo observed fossils in mountains and rejected easy explanations that treated them as accidental forms or remnants of a single simple event. He thought carefully about water, sediment, erosion, and the way seas and land might have changed over long periods. These reflections placed him among the more serious observers of natural process in his age. He did not possess the later sciences that would explain the Earth's history in modern terms. He did possess a refusal to accept explanations that did not answer what the evidence showed. The notebooks therefore reveal a man who did not experience knowledge as a set of separate rooms. Anatomy, painting, hydraulics, mechanics, optics, geology, architecture, and flight all opened into one another. A lesser account calls this universal genius and then stops. A better account notices the labor behind the range. Leonardo measured, drew, compared, revised, and returned. He asked questions that could exhaust a more settled worker because every answer uncovered another structure beneath it. This abundance came at a cost. The same habit that made him remarkable also made completion difficult. A painting became a study of optics, anatomy, expression, and technique. A monument became a problem of animal motion, casting, mass, and dynastic meaning. A canal became a study of fluid force. A flying machine became an inquiry into birds, air, weight, and mechanics. Patrons wanted objects. Leonardo often found systems. The mismatch followed him from city to city. Francesco Melzi, who entered Leonardo's life as a young pupil and companion, would later become crucial to the survival of this paper world. Unlike many assistants who passed through artists' workshops, Melzi became a devoted keeper of Leonardo's manuscripts after the master's death. The importance of that care can hardly be overstated. Because Leonardo did not publish his notebooks as finished works, their survival depended on human custody. Paper is fragile, and thought written on paper is only as safe as the hands that preserve it. The notebooks were not fully known to Leonardo's own age in the way they are known now. Much of their fame belongs to later discovery, dispersal, collection, and study. This delayed afterlife has shaped the modern image of Leonardo as a man who anticipated future centuries. That image contains some truth, but it can also mislead. He was not living outside history, sending messages to modernity. He was a Renaissance artist, engineer, natural philosopher, working with the tools, materials, books, bodies, courts, and questions available to him. His originality grew from his age even when it strained against its limits. What makes the notebooks so moving is their unfinished honesty. They show thought before it has been cleaned into doctrine. They preserve mistakes beside insights, practical designs beside impossible hopes, careful studies beside sudden questions. Leonardo's mind appears not as a marble monument, but as labor spread across pages. The hand that made faces gentle also opened bodies, studied rivers, pursued flight, measured shadows, and traced the turning of machines. Behind the famous paintings stood this larger field of inquiry, and as his public career moved toward Rome, the notebooks continued to carry the restless work that no single patron could contain. Chapter 15. Rome without rest. Rome offered Leonardo honor, but not the kind of central place that Milan had once given him. He arrived in a city where the scale of ambition was enormous, where popes built, collected, restored, decorated, and competed through art as visibly as princes did through armies. The Rome of the early 16th century was not merely an ancient capital filled with ruins. It was a living center of papal power, crowded with projects meant to bind Christian authority to imperial memory. For an artist of Leonardo's fame, such a city might have seemed like a final great stage. In practice, it became something more uneasy. His entrance into Rome came through Giuliano de' Medici, brother of Pope Leo X. The Medici had returned to power, and the family that had shaped Leonardo's Florentine youth now stood at the center of the papal court. Giuliano offered Leonardo patronage, lodging, and status, and this mattered for a man no longer young, still famous, still searching for conditions in which his range of interests could be sustained. Yet patronage under Giuliano did not become the same thing as command over Rome's great artistic future. Leonardo was respected, but respect alone did not make him necessary. Rome was already filled with younger masters whose work had taken possession of the city's imagination. Michelangelo had painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel only a few years earlier, filling it with bodies of immense force. prophets, sibyls, creation, fall, and judgment held in a visual language unlike anything else in Italy. Raphael, younger still, had become the brilliant organizer of papal rooms, devotional grace, classical balance, and courtly fluency. Their energy suited the public needs of Julius II and Leo X in ways Leonardo's late habits did not. Rome wanted walls finished, programs completed, and large statements made visible. Leonardo's difference was not a lack of greatness, it was a difference of rhythm. He carried with him decades of inquiry, a mind full of machines, anatomy, optics, water, painting, geometry, and unfinished projects. He could still draw, observe, invent, and advise with extraordinary subtlety. But the papal city rewarded sustained execution at a scale he had rarely delivered. Michelangelo could cover a ceiling under pressure and leave behind a finished force. Raphael could manage a large workshop and produce complex decorative programs with speed and elegance. Leonardo's gifts moved more slowly and more privately, often into problems that no patron had clearly requested. Giuliano de' Medici gave him rooms in the Belvedere at the Vatican, and Leonardo entered a household where experiments, pupils, assistants, papers, and devices could gather around him. He was not abandoned or obscure. He had status enough to be housed near power. Still, the nature of his work in Rome seems to have been fragmented. He studied mirrors and lenses. He thought about mechanics. He pursued anatomical interests until objections and restrictions appear to have interfered with that work. He explored devices, materials, and technical problems without producing a Roman masterpiece equal in public visibility to the works of Raphael and Michelangelo. This must have been a strange position. Leonardo's name was already large. He had painted The Last Supper. He had carried the Mona Lisa. He had designed the Sforza horse, mapped Imola, studied anatomy, and made himself famous across courts. Yet Rome did not organize itself around him. Younger men occupied the main walls. Papal attention moved through political needs, family interests, architectural plans, and artistic programs that required reliable production. Leonardo, who had once seemed too large for the category of painter, now found himself in a city where large systems of art moved past him. One episode from these years shows the tension between his curiosity and the expectations of those around him. According to Vasari, Pope Leo X remarked that Leonardo would never accomplish anything because he began thinking about the end before the beginning. The exactness of the remark is impossible to verify as a literal transcript, but its survival is revealing. It matches what patrons often experienced in him: preparation, experimentation, brilliance, delay. The sentence may be unfair, but unfairness can still preserve a social truth. People admired Leonardo and also wondered whether admiration would ever become delivery. Anatomy became more difficult in Rome. Leonardo's studies of the body had reached a remarkable level, especially through his earlier work and his association with Marcantonio della Torre. In Rome, however, such study appears to have encountered suspicion or obstruction. The city's religious and institutional environment did not make dissection impossible in every circumstance, but it could make access precarious and dependent on permission, trust, and reputation. For Leonardo, who treated the body as a structure to be understood through direct study, the interruption mattered. A line of inquiry that had occupied him deeply could not continue freely. Mechanical and optical interests filled some of that space. Leonardo's notes from his later years show attention to mirrors, lenses, geometry, weights, motion, and devices that could entertain, investigate, or serve practical curiosity. Such studies may seem small beside the great public works unfolding elsewhere in Rome, but they belong to the continuity of his mind. He did not stop asking how things behaved. Light still required explanation. Motion still invited diagrams. The relation between eye, surface, and image still held him. Where others saw a finished object, Leonardo often saw the problem that made the object possible. His household also remained part of the story. Salai was still connected to him, though their relationship had long been marked by affection, irritation, dependence, and disorder. Francesco Melzi, younger, disciplined, and devoted, became increasingly important. Melzi came from a noble Milanese family and offered Leonardo a kind of companionship and care different from Salai's troublesome loyalty. He would later preserve Leonardo's papers with a seriousness that shaped the master's afterlife. In Rome, the old man's world was not only papal corridors and artistic rivalries, it was also a household of assistants, manuscripts, habits, expenses, and uncertain futures. Rome's artistic climate sharpened the contrast between Leonardo and Michelangelo. Their temperaments had never been easy to join. Michelangelo's art seemed to carve form even in paint, pressing the human body into heroic tension. Leonardo preferred transitions, atmosphere, expression, and the hidden movements beneath visible surfaces. Michelangelo completed with severity. Leonardo returned to questions. The difference was not merely personal rivalry, though rivalry existed in memory and sometimes in life. It was a difference in how art should possess the world, by forceful form or by endless investigation. Raphael occupied another position altogether. He absorbed, organized, softened, and completed. His art could learn from Leonardo's portrait compositions and from Michelangelo's bodies, while still becoming recognizably his own. In Rome, Raphael's success depended partly on his ability to manage a large workshop and satisfy the papacy's appetite for finished rooms. Leonardo had known workshop production from his youth, but he never became the same kind of organizer of public programs. His authority was more solitary, even when people worked around him. His thought gathered on pages as much as on walls. Pope Leo X, as a Medici, ruled with tastes shaped by humanist culture, music, ceremony, family ambition, and the need to maintain papal authority in a dangerous political world. His court could appreciate brilliance, it could also consume it without fully using it. Leonardo's presence added prestige, but prestige is not the same as purpose. The old master became one distinguished figure among many in a city where attention was divided among diplomacy, war, finance, reform pressures, building projects, and the pleasures of a cultivated court. This Roman period therefore feels suspended. It is not empty, but it does not move with the force of Milan or the urgency of Florence's battle wall. Leonardo was working, thinking, experimenting, and observing, yet his public career no longer expanded in the way it once had. Age may have played a role. He was in his 60s, and the physical energy required for large projects, travel, and technical labor could not remain untouched by time. But age alone does not explain the mood of these years. The deeper issue was fit. Rome's needs and Leonardo's habits did not quite meet. Giuliano de' Medici's own declining health and death in 1516 further loosened Leonardo's Roman position. A patron's death had always been dangerous for him. Ludovico's fall had broken his first Milanese world. Cesare Borgia's collapse had ended his service in Romagna. Giuliano's disappearance removed the person through whom Leonardo's place in Rome had been most directly secured. Once again, the structure around him shifted. Once again, he had to consider where his name, his papers, his remaining strength, and his unfinished work might go. France began to offer what Rome had not fully given. King Francis I admired Italian art and wanted to draw prestige, learning, and magnificence into his own court. He was young, ambitious, and eager to surround French kingship with the cultural authority of Italy. For Leonardo, the invitation carried a different promise from the papal city. It did not demand that he compete for the main walls of Rome. It offered late honor, residence, and a role broad enough to contain painter, engineer, architect, advisor, and living treasure of the Italian Renaissance. The move toward France was not a retreat into obscurity. It was the final relocation of a man whose life had always depended on patrons, but whose mind had never belonged wholly to any patron's program. He left behind the city where Michelangelo and Raphael had become the visible masters of a new age. He carried with him paintings, notebooks, instruments, assistants, and the accumulated weight of work that was finished, damaged, unfinished, lost, or still private. Rome had respected him without fully using him. France would receive him differently, as an old master whose very presence could dignify a king's ambition. Leonardo's Roman years thus form a quiet turning in the biography. They show fame without command, patronage without deep fulfillment, inquiry without a great public monument. They also prepare the last movement of his life. The restless Florentine, the Milanese engineer, the painter of sacred walls, the maker of maps, the student of bodies and water, had reached the point where his future no longer depended on proving himself through a single commission. What remained was a final household, a final patron, and the papers that would carry more of him into the future than almost anyone around him could yet understand. Chapter 16: France and the Last Notebooks. France received Leonardo not as a young artist seeking permission, but as an old master whose name already carried the weight of Italy behind it. He crossed the Alps in the last years of his life, leaving Rome after a period of honor without deep usefulness, and came into the service of Francis I, the young King of France. The move was not a fall from greatness. It was a late rearrangement of it. Leonardo had spent decades trying to fit his restless range into workshops, courts, republics, papal households, military appointments, and unfinished commissions. In France, he was valued less for one promised painting than for the entire presence of the man. Francis had come to the throne in 1515, young, ambitious, and drawn toward the cultural prestige of Italy. French kings had long been involved in Italian politics, but Francis wanted more than territory and victory. He wanted the grace, learning, art, architecture, and magnificence that Italian courts seemed to possess in special abundance. Bringing Leonardo into his orbit served that desire. The old Florentine was not merely an employee. He was a living emblem of the world Francis admired and wished to gather around French kingship. Leonardo settled near Amboise, at the manor of Clos-Lucé, close to the royal chateau. The place gave him residence, honor, and proximity to the king, without requiring the constant public exertion of a Roman program or a Florentine civic war. He was given the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, a phrase that suits the breadth of his life better than almost any single professional label. Painter alone was too narrow. Engineer alone missed the tenderness of his images. Architect alone could not hold the notebooks, the anatomy, the water, the machines, and the unfinished faces. The French title allowed several Leonardos to exist together. He did not come empty-handed. Leonardo brought paintings, papers, drawings, instruments, and members of his household. The Mona Lisa was probably among the works that traveled with him, along with other paintings connected to his later years. These objects were not simply possessions. They were the portable remains of decades of labor, delay, refinement, and attachment. A wall painting could not travel. The Sforza horse had not survived as bronze. The battle wall in Florence had failed. But panels and papers could cross borders with the old man who had made them. Francesco Melzi was central in this last household. Young, educated, noble, and devoted, he had become far more than a casual pupil. He offered Leonardo companionship, assistance, and eventually preservation. Where Salai brought long familiarity, mischief, and a more disorderly loyalty, Melzi brought steadiness. The difference mattered. Leonardo's late life was filled not only with royal favor and famous works, but with the practical dependence of age, papers to organize, household needs to manage, movement to limit, memory to protect, and unfinished things to keep from scattering too soon. Salai, whose real name was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, remained part of the wider story. Though his exact movements and role in Leonardo's final French years are less straightforward than Melzi's, he had entered Leonardo's life as a boy in Milan and stayed connected to him for decades, despite the master's own notes describing thefts, lies, and troublesome behavior. It is tempting to tidy such relationships into simple affection or simple frustration. Leonardo's household rarely permits that neatness. Loyalty, dependence, irritation, beauty, usefulness, and habit all seem to have been present in different measures. At Clos-Lucé, Leonardo's daily work appears to have turned increasingly toward consultation, designs, and the care of accumulated thought rather than large new masterpieces. Francis I admired him and seems to have treated him with unusual warmth. Later tradition loved the image of the young king and the old master together because it joined royal power to artistic wisdom in a form pleasing to memory. The historical record supports the king's respect, even if some of the most dramatic images later attached to Leonardo's death belong more to legend than documentation. France gave him dignity, that much is clear. Design still occupied him. Leonardo considered architectural and engineering ideas for the French court, including festival designs, urban schemes, and perhaps plans connected to royal residences. Some projects remained uncertain in their exact authorship or degree of execution, as so often in his life. Yet the pattern continued. He was asked to think beyond painting. The same mind that had served Ludovico with machines and monuments, Cesare Borgia with maps, and Florence with civic battle, now served a French king with the prestige of invention itself. The law landscape around Amboise was not Milan, Florence, or Rome. Its courtly world had a different tone, shaped by French monarchy, hunting, chateaux, river valleys, and the desire to import Italian refinement into northern forms of power. Leonardo, who had moved between so many political arrangements, now lived inside a court that treated Italy as a source of cultural authority. In youth, he had gone from Vinci to Florence to learn. In age, he carried Florence, Milan, and Rome into France as memory and reputation. His body, however, was failing. A probable stroke or paralysis affected his right side in his later years, though the exact medical details remain uncertain. For a left-handed artist, the meaning of such impairment must be approached carefully. It did not simply erase his ability to think, draw, or work, but age had entered the practical conditions of the hand. The man who had spent his life studying movement now lived with movement reduced. This is one of the private sorrows that should be touched lightly. Leonardo's late dignity did not remove the ordinary limits of the body. His notebooks remained near him, and in some ways they were the truest companions of the final years. They held studies of anatomy, water, machines, optics, architecture, geometry, flight, painting, and the earth. They held questions never turned into books, diagrams never turned into machines, and observations never delivered to patrons. The papers were not organized as a finished legacy. Leonardo had often planned treatises, especially on painting and anatomy, but he had not brought them into final publishable order. His knowledge remained abundant and unstable, alive on pages rather than settled in volumes. Melzi's later role begins here, before Leonardo's death, in the simple fact of proximity. He knew the papers, he knew the old man's habits. He had the education and loyalty needed to understand that the manuscripts were not ordinary studio debris. After Leonardo died, Melzi inherited many of them and tried to preserve and arrange them. Without that care, much more might have disappeared. The survival of Leonardo's mind depended, in part, on another person's patience. Leonardo died at Amboise on May 6, 1519. He was 67 years old. The famous story that Francis I held him as he died has been cherished in art and imagination, but historians treat it cautiously. The king may not have been present in that exact way, and the image likely owes much to later romantic memory. It remains powerful because people wanted Leonardo's life to end in the arms of royal recognition, as if history itself had paused to honor him. The quieter truth is enough. He died in France, under royal patronage, with devoted companions near his work and with papers that had not yet begun their long, uneven journey through time. His burial took place at Amboise, though later damage, religious conflict, rebuilding, and the passage of centuries complicated the history of his remains. Even in death, Leonardo did not receive the simple continuity that later fame might seem to promise. Tombs can be disturbed, churches can be altered, records can thin, bodies can lose the certainty that names keep. The man who studied bones so carefully entered a history in which his own physical resting place became less secure than the images and papers associated with him. The paintings followed another path. Works he had carried into France entered royal collections and, over time, became part of the artistic inheritance of the French state. The Mona Lisa, especially, began its long movement from private or courtly possession toward public fame. Leonardo could not have known the scale of that afterlife. No painter working in a room, returning to a face across years, can truly know what millions of later eyes will do with the surface. He had kept the portrait close. History would make it almost impossible to approach closely. The notebooks had a more broken journey. Melzi preserved many papers at first, but after his death, they were gradually dispersed, sold, separated, rebound, lost, and collected in different places. Sheets that had once belonged to a working mind were divided among owners and libraries. Some survived in codices, others disappeared. The order Leonardo had given them, already loose and private, became even more difficult to recover. Modern admiration often imagines the notebooks as one great treasury. Their actual survival was more fragile, depending on inheritance, curiosity, accident, and the market for remarkable things. That fragility is fitting, because so much of Leonardo's life existed between survival and loss. The Last Supper survived as a damaged wall. The Sforza horse survived as studies and memory. The Battle of Anghiari survived through copies and descriptions. The Mona Lisa survived because it traveled with him and entered powerful collections. The anatomical studies survived because Melzi and later collectors did not let every page vanish. Leonardo's legacy was not a clean monument. It was a field of remnants, some luminous, some broken, some mislaid, some recovered after long silence. What makes him endure is not that he finished everything he began. He plainly did not. Patrons waited. Walls failed, monuments remained uncast, treatises stayed incomplete. The more durable fact is that he pursued the visible world with a kind of disciplined hunger that refused to accept the surface as final. A smile invited the study of muscles and light. A horse invited anatomy, motion, bronze, and memory. A river invited hydraulics, geology, and the movement of time. A city invited mapping. A body invited structure. A wing invited the dream of mechanical flight. Yet even this should not turn him into a figure outside ordinary history. Leonardo needed fathers, masters, patrons, assistants, rulers, monks, merchants, dukes, popes, kings, and heirs. He needed workshops to train him, courts to pay him, hospitals to permit study, and households to carry his papers. His gifts were extraordinary, but they did not float free from the world. They passed through contracts, rooms, roads, illnesses, politics, failures, and the hands of those who kept what he left behind. At the end, the story returns less to the legend than to the material things that remained. A few paintings, many drawings, notes written backward across paper, machines that stayed imagined, bodies opened in study and then closed by time. Water traced in curling lines, faces softened by shadow. Horses that never reached bronze, maps that made cities visible from above. The life had moved from Vinci to Florence, from Milan to Romagna, from Rome to France, and across that movement, Leonardo had turned attention itself into a form of labor. After his death, the household loosened. Melzi carried papers back to Italy and guarded them for decades. Salai received works and property of his own, and his part of the inheritance would follow a different path. Francis I kept the prestige of having sheltered the old master. France kept paintings that would become central to its royal and national collections. Italy kept the memory of the cities that had formed him. No single place could claim all of Leonardo. He had belonged to too many rooms. The final image is not the king at the deathbed, however beloved that story became. It is quieter and more durable than that. It is paper after a life of unfinished work, sheets covered with ink, diagrams, measurements, questions, and drawings of things seen too carefully to be ordinary. The hand that made them was gone. The pages remained, not in perfect order, not untouched by loss, but still carrying lines that moved from a body into the future. There were drawings of water that still seemed to turn. There were studies of hands that still seemed ready to move. There were machines that never left the page and faces that never fully surrendered their expression. In the slow afterlife of those papers, Leonardo continued without speech, held in brown ink, silver point, chalk, and the worn fibers of sheets that had cost more time than any patron could have promised him. The man from Vinci had ended, but the marks remain. The journey is complete. Rest well.